Clara Whitmore pressed both hands flat against the wooden floor of her mother's kitchen and did not cry. She had learned years ago that crying only made it worse. The basket had slipped. Just a basket. Dried beans scattered across the floor like buckshot rolling into corners, disappearing under the stove, and her mother stood over her, the way a judge stands over a man already sentenced, not looking for guilt, just waiting to deliver the verdict she'd already written. "Get up," Margaret Whitmore said, "and don't look at me like that." Clara stood. Her knees hurt. Her hands were red from the cold water she'd been hauling since before dawn, and there was flour on her sleeve from the bread she'd started at 4 in the morning because Margaret wanted it ready before the sun came up. "I'll clean it," Clara said quietly. "You'll do more than clean it," her mother said. "You'll think about why you can't hold a simple basket without dropping it like a child. 20 years old and still fumbling around my kitchen like you've never seen a floor before." Clara said nothing. She got down on her knees again and began gathering the beans one by one. That was the morning of June the 3rd, 1886. And that was how most mornings began in the Whitmore house, with Clara on her knees and Margaret standing over her, and the silence between them filled with everything a mother had never once chosen to say. Before you go any further, if this story is already reaching something inside you, I want you to subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story. And when you're done watching, leave a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I read every single one, and it means the world to me to see how far these stories travel. Now let's go back to Clara. Red Hollow, Colorado was the kind of town that remembered everything and forgave nothing. 1,200 people wedged between two mountain ridges connected to the rest of the world by a single road that turned to mud every spring and froze solid every winter. The kind of place where your grandfather's mistakes were still talked about over Sunday supper. Where a woman's worth was measured by who she married and how quiet she kept herself in the meantime. Clara Whitmore had been born into the wrong equation. Her father, Thomas Whitmore, had been a decent man, quiet, steady, the kind of man who fixed things without being asked and listened more than he spoke. He died of fever when Clara was 9, and the day they put him in the ground was the last day Margaret Whitmore ever looked at her daughter with anything resembling warmth. After that, Clara became something else to her mother, not a child to be raised, an obligation to be managed, a debt that kept accruing interest without any promise of being repaid. By the time Clara was 12, she was doing the laundry. By 14, she was running the household accounts. By 17, she could butcher a chicken preserve, a season's worth of vegetables, sew a dress from a single bolt of fabric, and negotiate with the dry goods merchant over pricing. All things her mother had decided were beneath her own dignity to continue doing now that she had a daughter old enough to do them instead. Margaret Whitmore was not a stupid woman. She was, in fact, sharp in the way that cutting things are sharp, precise, deliberate, and capable of drawing blood without ever appearing to try. She had a talent for making Clara feel grateful for her own suffering, for framing every cruelty as preparation, every insult as instruction. "I'm harder on you because the world will be harder on you," she used to say when Clara was small. "You're not pretty enough to coast on your looks. You're not charming enough to make men forget your flaws. The only thing you have going for you is that you're useful. So be useful and stop complaining." Clara had believed her. For years and years, she had believed every word. She believed she was ordinary in a way that made her invisible. She believed her hands, rough and capable, and always working, were something to be ashamed of rather than proud of. She believed the ache that lived permanently in her chest was just the natural condition of being alive, that everyone felt it, that it had no name and no cure and no end. She did not know it had a name. She did not know the name was loneliness. The morning after the dropped basket, Margaret announced over breakfast that she'd arranged a meeting with Henry Caldwell. Clara looked up from the stove. "What kind of meeting?" she asked. "A business meeting," Margaret said without looking up from her coffee. "He's interested in a formal arrangement. You'd move into his house on Birch Street. He has a cook and 2 housemaids already, so you wouldn't have to do much beyond manage his social calendar and present yourself decently at dinner." Clara set down the spoon she was holding, slowly, carefully. The way you set down something breakable when your hands have started to shake. You're talking about marriage, she said. I'm talking about a solution, Margaret said. Henry Caldwell is 53 years old. He owns the lumber mill and half the property on the East Ridge, and he's agreed to settle a fair sum on this household in exchange for the arrangement. It's more than most girls in your position could hope for. I don't want to marry Henry Caldwell. The kitchen went very still. Margaret set down her coffee cup. She looked at Clara the way she always looked at her when Clara said something that surprised her, not with anger, yet, but with a cold, measuring patience. The way a person looks at a problem before they decide how to solve it. What you want, Margaret said slowly, has never been the primary consideration. He's older than my father would have been, Clara said. He's been married twice and both his wives left town without saying goodbye to anyone. Mrs. Abernathy told me he... Mrs. Abernathy is a gossip and a fool, Margaret said. And you are standing in my kitchen at 20 years old with no prospects, no savings, no particular beauty, and no skills beyond what I have taught you. You do not get to be particular, Clara. You get to be grateful. Clara turned back to the stove. She did not argue further. She stirred the oatmeal and kept her face still, and let the familiar feeling settle over her, that sinking, pressing weight that always followed her mother's pronouncements. The feeling of a door closing, the feeling of walls. But something else was happening underneath it. Something small and new and frightened of itself. A sensation she barely recognized because she'd had so little practice with it. She was angry. Not the dull, resigned kind of anger she sometimes felt late at night when she was too tired to keep it pressed down. This was different. This was sharp. This had edges. She did not know what to do with it yet. So she stirred the oatmeal and said nothing, and waited the way she had always waited for whatever came next. What came next was a Tuesday in late June when Margaret Whitmore walked her daughter into the center of Red Hollow's main street and humiliated her in front of 40 witnesses. It had started simply enough. Clara had been carrying a crate of preserves to the general store. 12 jars of peach preserves she'd spent 3 days making from scratch when her foot caught a raised plank in the boardwalk and she stumbled. She caught herself. She did not fall. But one jar slipped from the crate and hit the ground and shattered, and peach preserves spread across the dusty boardwalk in a sweet, sticky mess. Clara knelt immediately to clean what she could, pulling a rag from her apron pocket. Margaret appeared from behind her as if she'd been waiting for exactly this moment. "Leave it," her mother said loudly. Loudly enough that 3 women outside the milliner's shop turned to look. Loudly enough that 2 men on horseback paused in the street. "Mama, I just need to—" "Leave it," I said. Margaret's hand closed around Clara's arm and pulled her upright with a grip that would leave marks. "Look at you. 1 jar. 1 jar out of 12, and you're down in the dirt making a spectacle. Do you know how long it took me to source those jars? Do you even think before you move, or do you simply blunder through the world destroying things and expecting other people to manage the damage?" The street had gone quiet. Not completely quiet. There was still the sound of horses and the creak of wagon wheels somewhere down the block. But the particular human noise of conversation and footsteps had stopped. People were watching. People always watched in Red Hollow. Watching was practically a civic tradition. Clara felt the heat rise in her face. She felt it in her hands, in her throat. "I'm sorry," she said, because that was what she said. That was always what she said. "Sorry doesn't replace a jar of preserves," Margaret said. "Sorry doesn't explain why a grown woman can't carry a crate 20 yards without destroying something. You are 20 years old, and you cannot perform a simple task without— Ma'am." The voice came from the edge of the street. It was not a loud voice. It was not the voice of a man trying to interrupt or dominate or make himself known. It was calm, flat. The kind of voice that doesn't need to raise itself because something in its register makes people stop and pay attention anyway. Margaret paused. Clara looked up. There was a man standing near the corner of the dry goods store, one shoulder against the post arms crossed loosely at his chest. He was tall, the kind of tall that reads differently on a man who clearly knows how to use his body, not like height that apologizes for itself. Dark hair a few weeks past needing a cut. a jaw like something carved to last. He wore a gray canvas work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the heat, and his boots were the boots of a man who worked land for a living, worn resolute shaped to him. His eyes were on Margaret Whitmore. Not on Clara. On Margaret. And the look in them was not hostile. It was something quieter and more unsettling than hostility. It was the look of a man who has decided something. "She dropped a jar," he said, the same flat, unhurried voice. "That's all that happened here." Margaret stiffened. "I beg your pardon." "You're welcome to beg it," the man said. He did not move. He did not uncross his arms. "But it seems like a jar of preserves is getting quite a lot of attention when the person who made them is the one being made to feel small." The silence stretched. A horse shifted its weight somewhere behind them. One of the women near the milliner's shop had pressed her lips together and was looking studiously at the ground. Margaret drew herself up to her full height, which was considerable. "This is a family matter," she said coldly, "and I don't believe I know you." "Ethan Walker," the man said. "I ranch up on the Black Pine Ridge, and no ma'am, you don't know me, but I know what I'm looking at." He glanced at Clara, then just for a moment, just a single pass of those dark level eyes, and then he looked back at Margaret, and he did not say anything else, because he had apparently said what he came to say. Margaret turned away from him with the precision of someone who has decided to pretend a person no longer exists. She tightened her grip on Clara's arm and said very quietly, "Come along." And Clara went because she always went, because her feet knew how to follow her mother, even when the rest of her wanted to stay fixed to that spot on the boardwalk and look back at the man who had just done something nobody in Red Hollow had ever done before. He had looked at her mother and not flinched. He had said something true in front of witnesses. And then he had looked at Clara briefly, carefully, the way a man looks at something he is trying to understand, rather than something he is trying to possess. And in that single moment, she had felt something she had no name for. Seen. Just that. Just the plain, ordinary, devastating feeling of being seen. She carried it home like the last unbroken jar in the crate, holding it steady, barely breathing, afraid of what would happen if she let herself examine it too closely. That evening after supper was made, and the dishes were washed, and her mother had retired to the front room with her sewing, Clara stood at the kitchen window in the dark and pressed her forehead against the cool glass and tried to understand what was wrong with her, that a stranger's single glance could undo something she'd spent 20 years carefully holding together. "Nothing is wrong with you," said something small and stubborn at the back of her mind. She pushed it away. But it didn't go far. 3 days later, Henry Caldwell came to call. Clara was in the garden when she heard his voice. A particular kind of voice, smooth on the surface and sour underneath, like fruit that looks fine until you cut into it. And she straightened up slowly from the bean rows and wiped her hands on her apron and stood very still for a moment, listening. She could hear her mother's voice through the open window, bright and accommodating in a way she almost never was. The voice Margaret Whitmore used when she was managing something she considered important. Clara walked around to the front of the house and stood in the doorway. Henry Caldwell was sitting at her mother's best table, in her mother's best chair, drinking from the china cups Margaret brought out twice a year. He was a large man who had once been muscular and was now simply large, a broad face, small eyes that moved quickly, hands that rested on the table with the settled comfort of a man accustomed to ownership. He looked at Clara in the doorway. He smiled. It was the kind of smile that made Clara think of a hand closing over something it intended to keep. "Clara," her mother said with a precise brightness that was also a warning. "Come in and greet Mr. Caldwell properly." Clara stepped inside. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. "Miss Whitmore." His eyes moved over her in a way that was not quite rude, but was not quite decent either. "Your mother's told me a great deal about you. She says you're capable. That's a quality I value highly in a household. A household. Not a wife. A household." "I'm sure she's very kind," Clara said, and kept her voice level. "We were just discussing the practical terms," Margaret said smoothly. "Mr. Caldwell is prepared to be quite generous, and I've explained that you're a sensible girl who understands the value of a secure arrangement." I haven't agreed to any arrangement, Clara said. The temperature in the room dropped approximately 10 degrees. Margaret's smile did not waver. Clara, dear, why don't you bring in the other cups and— I haven't agreed, Clara said again, steadier this time. She looked at Henry Caldwell, who was watching her with those quick, assessing eyes. I appreciate your interest, Mr. Caldwell, but I'm not available for arrangement. Henry Caldwell leaned back in his chair. He was still smiling, but it was different now, less ownership, more calculation. Perhaps your mother and I could speak with you further, he said in the patient tone of a man who is accustomed to gentle pressure producing eventual compliance. Perhaps, Clara said, but the answer will be the same. She set down the dish towel she'd been holding, placed it on the kitchen table, and walked out the back door into the garden, because if she stayed in that room one more moment, she was going to say something that couldn't be unsaid, and she was not yet ready for what came after. She stood in the garden in the cooling afternoon and pressed her hands against her knees and breathed. From inside the house, she heard her mother's voice, low, sharp, controlled. She could not make out the words. She did not try. An hour later, after Henry Caldwell's wagon had rattled away down the road, Margaret appeared in the garden doorway. Clara turned around. Her mother's face was the face she wore when she had been embarrassed in a way that would take time to process before it became someone else's fault. The face of a woman gathering herself. That, Margaret said, was possibly the most foolish thing you have ever done. I won't marry him, Clara said. You will. I won't. You listen to me. Margaret crossed the garden in 4 brisk steps and stood close enough that Clara could smell her lavender powder and the coffee she'd served to Henry Caldwell, close enough to be intimidating, which had worked for years and years and was working slightly less well right now. You have nothing. Do you understand me? You have no money, no property, no prospects beyond what I create for you. Henry Caldwell is a man of means, and he is willing to overlook your shortcomings and provide you a life you could not build for yourself in 1,000 years. And you stood in my parlor and threw it back in his face like some foolish girl in a storybook who thinks love is a thing that pays the bills. I don't need love, Clara said. I need to not be sold. The word landed between them. Margaret went very still. That's a vicious thing to say, she said. It's an accurate thing to say, Clara said. He talked about me like I was livestock he was considering purchasing. You agreed to terms without asking me a single question. You don't want to place me, Mama. You want to be rid of me. And you want someone to pay you for the privilege. The slap came faster than Clara expected, a quick, open-handed thing that snapped her head to the side and left heat spreading across her cheek. She did not cry. She turned her face back forward and looked at her mother. Margaret's hand was still raised. Her breath was coming quick and shallow. For a single unguarded moment, she looked like something other than Margaret Whitmore. She looked frightened, or something in the neighborhood of frightened. She looked like a woman who had gone too far and knew it, and was already constructing the story in which she had not. Get out of my garden, Margaret said. Mama, get out of my house. The voice was very quiet now. Quieter than shouting. Quieter than the slap. You want to make your own decisions? Fine. Make them somewhere else. Pack what's yours and get out. You have until dark. Clara stood there for a moment, looking at her mother's face, at the set of her jaw, the controlled shake of her hands, the way her eyes had gone hard and distant, the way they always did when Margaret Whitmore had decided to be done with something. Then she went inside. She moved carefully and without rushing, because rushing would have felt like panic, and she refused to panic. She took the dress her father had bought her the last Christmas before he died. She took the small leather journal she'd kept hidden under the kitchen floorboard for 3 years. She took her good work boots and 2 shawls and the coin purse with the $4.60 she'd saved over 18 months by shorting herself on the household accounts in amounts too small for her mother to notice. She did not take anything that wasn't hers. She stood in the kitchen one last time and looked around at the stove she'd tended, and the table she'd scrubbed, and the window she'd stood at in the dark, telling herself things were fine. Then she walked out the front door and closed it behind her. The evening air hit her like something physical. The street was quiet. Most of Red Hollow's residents were inside at this hour, sitting down to supper, and the town had that particular closed-up feeling of a place that has drawn its shutters and decided to be private for a while. Clara stood on the step with her small bag and her $4.60, and the rapidly cooling certainty that she had done the right thing. The right thing, as it turned out, was cold. She had nowhere to go. Mrs. Abernathy would take her in for a night, maybe two. But Mrs. Abernathy was also Margaret Whitmore's nearest neighbor and oldest acquaintance, and accepting her charity would put her directly in the path of her mother's orbit by morning. The church had a room sometimes for women in difficult circumstances, but Reverend Blaine was Henry Caldwell's brother-in-law, which was almost certainly not a coincidence. The boarding house on 3rd Street cost $1 a week, which meant she had 4 weeks before she was out of money and out of options. She sat down on the front step because her legs had decided they were done standing. The light was going out of the sky. Orange, then pink, then that deep bruised blue that came just before full dark. From down the street came the sound of hoofbeats, slow, deliberate, not hurrying. Clara did not look up. The hoofbeats stopped. Miss Whitmore. She knew the voice before she raised her head. She'd spent 3 days hearing it in the back of her mind, turning it over, examining it the way you examine something unexpected that turns out not to be ordinary at all. Ethan Walker sat on a dark bay horse at the edge of the street. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her mother on the boardwalk, not aggressive, not pitying, just level, just honest. "You're sitting on the step," he said. "I am," Clara agreed. "With a bag." "Yes." A pause. His horse shifted, and he steadied it without looking down. "Your mother put you out," he said. Not a question. "I left," Clara said, because that was also true, and she needed it to be true. Ethan Walker looked at her for a long moment. Then he swung down off the horse and stood in the street with his reins in one hand and looked at her. And the evening light was going fast now, and in the dusk his face was harder to read, but his eyes were the same as they'd been on the boardwalk, direct and careful, and not looking away. "I heard what happened with Caldwell," he said. Clara said nothing. "Man's got a reputation," Ethan said. "Not a good one. You did right." "I did what I had to do," Clara said. "I'm not sure they're the same thing." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "Reckon they might be in this case," he said. He was quiet for a moment. He looked down the street and then back at her, and she could tell he was thinking about something, not working up to saying it, so much as deciding whether saying it was the right thing to do. "I've got a ranch," he said, "up on the Black Pine. It's a working property, cattle mostly. I've been running it alone since my brother passed, going on 3 years now. I'm not—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not good company. I'll say that straight out. I keep to myself, and I work hard, and I don't talk much, and it's not an easy life." Clara waited. "But it's honest work," he said. "And there's a room, and nobody there is going to arrange you like furniture." She stared at him. "Mr. Walker." "I'm not offering you anything beyond what I said," he told her, and his voice was still flat and even and careful. "A room and honest work. You'd help with the books maybe, the household management. I'm behind on the account ledger, something embarrassing, and I know it. You'd be paid a fair wage, same as any worker. And I'd have no claim on your time beyond what's agreed and no say in what you do with the wage you earn." Clara looked at this man, this stranger who had said one true thing in a street while the rest of Red Hollow watched and said nothing, who had somehow known she was sitting on this step at this hour, who was standing in the gathering dark, making her a careful and honest offer, as if that were a perfectly ordinary thing to do. "Why?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment. "Because you shouldn't be sitting on that step," he said simply. A silence opened between them. Not uncomfortable, not pressing, just the quiet of two people who are saying more than their words, and both know it. "You don't know anything about me," Clara said. "No," he agreed. But I know you went back for that broken jar instead of walking away. I know you told your mother no, and then you told Caldwell no, and then you left with whatever fit in that bag and didn't make a scene about any of it. He paused. That tells me most of what I need to know. Clara looked down at her hands, her rough, capable, endlessly working hands. She thought about her mother's kitchen, about the dropped basket, and the scattered beans, and the sound of a slap in a garden. She thought about $4.60 and 4 weeks and no options. She thought about Henry Caldwell's small, quick eyes. She thought about the word seen and how it felt and how little she had felt it before 3 days ago. I'll need to know the wages before I agree to anything, she said. His mouth moved, definitely a smile this time, brief and real, and entirely unlike anything she'd expected from his face. That's fair, he said. And I'll want Sundays. Done. And I don't cook for anyone who doesn't say thank you. The smile again, just for a second. I've been saying thank you since I was 4 years old, miss. My mama was particular about it. Clara stood up. She picked up her bag. She looked at Ethan Walker standing in the road with his horse and his careful eyes and his honest offer, and she thought about every door that had closed in her life and how each one had felt like the end of something, and how this somehow felt like the opposite of that. You'll have to tell me how to get up to the Black Pine, she said. I've never been that far up the ridge. I know the way, Ethan said. He offered a hand to help her onto his horse, and she took it, and his grip was firm and steady, and released the moment she was settled, and that detail, that immediate, deliberate release, told her something she could not quite articulate, but felt with the same certainty. She felt the evening air on her face, and the solid warmth of the horse beneath her. He handed up her bag. Then he took the reins and began to lead the horse down the street on foot in the growing dark, heading toward the road that climbed up into the Black Pine Mountains. Behind them, Red Hollow closed its shutters and went on about its business. Neither of them looked back. The road up to the Black Pine Ridge was not a road so much as a suggestion. 2 worn tracks in the earth, where wagon wheels had passed enough times to press the grass flat, winding upward through country that got steeper and quieter the higher you climbed. Ethan led the horse on foot the whole way, not saying much, and Clara sat in the saddle and said even less, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable exactly, but it was full, the way silences are when 2 people are both thinking harder than they're talking. She had made a decision in under 10 minutes that would have taken most women in Red Hollow 10 years of deliberation. She was aware of this. She was also aware that there was a difference between recklessness and necessity, and what she had done tonight fell firmly into the second category. There were no good options waiting for her back in town. There was her mother's house, Henry Caldwell's ring, the church's charity room, and 4 weeks of savings before the arithmetic ran out. Against all of that, a man who'd said 3 decent things in 3 days and offered honest wages for honest work was not a gamble. It was the only door still open. She told herself that. She mostly believed it. It was past 9 o'clock when the lights of the Walker Ranch came into view, a low solid house, a barn, a system of fenced enclosures running out to the north, everything built to last rather than to impress. Ethan stopped the horse at the front post and helped Clara down with the same practical grip as before, the kind that accomplished what it needed to, and then let go. Kitchen's there, he said, nodding toward a side door. Room's off the back hallway, second door on the left. There's a latch on the inside. Wash water in the pitcher by the window. A pause. I'll be up before dawn, but you don't need to be. Take tomorrow to settle yourself. Clara looked at him. I'm not much for sleeping in, she said. Suit yourself. Breakfast is at 6 if you want it. She took her bag and went inside. The room was small and plain, and nothing about it was designed for comfort. But the blanket on the narrow bed was thick wool, and the latch on the door was solid iron, and when she pressed her hand against it, she felt a thing she hadn't felt in a very long time, in any room, in any house. Safe. Not happy. Not home. Not yet. But safe in the basic bones-deep way of a door you can close against the world. She sat on the edge of the bed and let out a breath she had probably been holding since June the 3rd. Then she opened her journal, found a clean page, and wrote 2 words. I left. She stared at them for a long time. Then she closed the journal, lay down in her clothes, and was asleep before she could think another thought. She was up at 5:15. She could not help it. Her body had been waking at 5 for so many years that sleeping past it felt like missing a step on a staircase, that sudden lurching awareness that something expected had not happened. She dressed, found the kitchen, assessed what was in it, with the practiced efficiency of a woman who has been managing a household since she was 12, and had coffee on and biscuits in the Dutch oven by the time she heard boots on the porch. Ethan Walker stopped in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the coffee. He looked at the biscuits. He looked at Clara standing at the stove with her sleeves rolled and her hair pinned back, and something crossed his face that she couldn't quite read. Surprise maybe, or something more complicated than surprise. You said breakfast at 6, Clara said. It's 5:58. It is, he said. He hung his hat on the peg by the door and sat down at the kitchen table, and Clara poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of him, and took the other to the opposite side of the table and sat down because she was not going to stand at the stove and serve a man while he sat. That was one thing she had decided before she fell asleep. Ethan looked at his coffee. Then he looked at her. You don't have to cook, he said. I know I don't, Clara said. I wanted coffee. Making enough for one is wasteful. The corner of his mouth moved. Fair enough. They drank their coffee. The biscuits came out, and they ate them. And outside, the sky was doing the thing it does in early summer at high elevation, going from black to deep blue to something luminous, all in the space of 20 minutes. And neither of them spoke much, but neither of them seemed bothered by that. After breakfast, Ethan pushed back his chair and said, I'll show you where I keep the ledgers. Whenever you're ready, Clara said. He led her to a room off the main hall that served as a combination office and storage space, a desk, 2 shelves of record books, a battered filing box, and approximately 4 years' worth of accounts in a state that made Clara breathe carefully through her nose when she saw them. I know, Ethan said. When did you last reconcile the purchase records against the supply invoices? She asked. A silence. Define reconcile, he said. Clara looked at him. He looked at her. Then she pulled out the nearest ledger, sat down, and got to work. She spent the better part of that first morning simply sorting, separating what was current from what was overdue, identifying which accounts had been neglected, noting where numbers had been rounded in ways that would eventually create problems. It was the kind of work most people found tedious, and she found genuinely satisfying, like untangling a knot, like organizing a drawer that had been chaotic for too long. There was a logic underneath the mess, and she could see it, and seeing it clearly was its own particular pleasure. Ethan came in around 10 with 2 cups of water and set one on the desk beside her without a word. Thank you, she said without looking up. He stopped. She looked up. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at her in the boardwalk, not with want, not with assessment, but with that quiet, unhurried attention, like he was listening to something that hadn't been said out loud yet. You're good at this, he said. I've been managing accounts since I was 14, Clara said. My mother thought it was something a servant would do. I thought it was something useful. Something shifted in his expression. Your mother was wrong about a lot of things, he said. Yes, Clara said. She was. She went back to the ledger. After a moment, she heard him leave, and she let herself sit with the strange, warm, slightly frightening feeling of having agreed out loud with something she'd only ever believed privately. The first week passed like that. Clara worked the accounts mornings, helped with the household afternoons, and learned the rhythms of a ranch built for one man. Gradually, the way you learn the layout of a house in the dark carefully with your hands out, trying not to knock anything over. She learned that Ethan was up at 4:30, regardless of weather. That he checked the north fence line every Tuesday and Thursday without fail. That he talked to his horses in a low, even murmur that he absolutely did not realize he was doing. That he left his coffee cup on the left side of the sink because he was left-handed, and reaching across to the right was a thing he'd apparently never thought about. That he said thank you every single time she handed him anything, without exception. Thank you for the coffee. Thank you for the water. Thank you. When she passed him a tool he'd asked for, and each time it landed in her chest, like a small, precise stone, dropped into still water, she learned that he did not ask questions about her life before the ranch. Not because he wasn't curious, she could tell that he was, but because he seemed to understand, with a kind of instinctive decency. She hadn't encountered much that some things needed to be offered rather than extracted. So she was the one who offered eventually on a Thursday evening when they were both sitting on the porch because the heat inside was too much and the air outside had finally cooled. "My father died when I was 9, she said, not looking at him, looking at the dark shape of the ridge against the sky. After that, she just decided I was the solution to all her problems. The housekeeper, the cook, the errand girl. The thing that kept the household running so she didn't have to." Ethan said nothing. He was looking at the same ridge. "She wasn't always mean," Clara said, and meant it because it was true and because it mattered to say it was true. "When I was small, she used to read to me. She had this book of fairy tales she'd had since she was a girl. She used to do voices for all the characters." She paused. "I don't know what happened to that woman. I don't know when she left and the other one took over. I just know that by the time I was old enough to notice the difference, the first one was already gone." A long silence. "My brother was like that," Ethan said. She looked at him. "After our parents died, he changed. Not mean like he never turned cold, more like he turned scared. Scared of everything going wrong all the time, always. He couldn't rest. Couldn't let himself enjoy anything because he was always watching the edges of it for where it would break." He stopped. "Winter took him 3 years ago. Fever, same as your father. He was 27 years old." Clara said, "I'm sorry." "Yeah," he said. They sat with that for a while. "Is that why you stay up here alone?" she asked. Not prying, just asking the way people ask each other things when they've decided to be honest. Ethan thought about it for a moment. "Partly," he said. "Partly because people in town have an idea of me that's easier to not fight than to fix." "What kind of idea?" "Cold," he said. "Dangerous, some of them say. Strange." He looked down at his hands. "I don't talk enough for most people's comfort. I don't go to the dances. I don't gossip. I don't perform being agreeable when I'm not. That tends to make people decide you're a problem before you've done anything at all." Clara thought about that. "People in town think I'm pathetic," she said. "The girl who lets her mother treat her like that. Why doesn't she just leave, they say. What's wrong with her?" "You did leave," Ethan said, eventually. "Most people don't." She looked at her own hands now, the red knuckles, the calluses, the small scar on her left thumb from a knife that had slipped 2 winters ago. "I left because you offered somewhere to go," she said. "If you hadn't been there, you'd have found somewhere," he said. Quiet but certain. "Might have taken longer, might have cost more, but you'd have gotten out." She wasn't sure that was true. She wasn't sure of much these days, actually. She was discovering that certainty is a thing that lives mostly in familiar rooms, and she was in unfamiliar country now in more ways than one. But she noticed that when Ethan Walker said something about her, he said it the way people say things they actually believe. Not to comfort, not to manage, just to tell the truth as he saw it. That was new too. That was something she was going to have to get used to. It was in the second week that things began to shift in a direction she hadn't planned for. She was working through the older supply invoices, the ones from 2 and 3 years back, that hadn't been properly filed, when she found a discrepancy that made her stop. She went back through it twice, then a third time, more slowly. Then she picked up the relevant ledger, the invoice in question, and the last 2 years of purchase records, and carried all of it to where Ethan was working in the barn. "I need you to look at something," she said. He straightened up, read her expression. "What is it?" She spread the papers on a clean stretch of workbench and showed him. The invoices from Caldwell Lumber, going back 18 months, consistently billing the ranch for materials at prices 10 to 15% above the going rate from any other supplier. The payments going out in Ethan's name against accounts he'd clearly not reviewed closely because he trusted the man he was doing business with. "Caldwell's been overcharging you," she said. Consistently. Over 18 months, that's... She pointed to a number she'd written in the margin, approximately $230. Ethan went very still. "You're certain?" he said. "I checked it 3 times," Clara said. "I can check it a 4th if you want. The pattern's clear. Every invoice from Caldwell Lumber runs 12 to 14% above what the same materials cost from Donovan's out of Glenwood. You've been paying the difference every time without questioning it." "Because I trusted him," Ethan said. His voice was flat. But under the flatness was something else, not just anger, though the anger was there. Something colder. The specific temperature of a man who has just understood that he's been made a fool of by someone he never liked to begin with. "Henry Caldwell," he said. "Henry Caldwell," Clara confirmed. Something clicked behind his eyes. He looked at her. "He came after you because your mother told him this ranch was in trouble," he said slowly. "If the accounts looked bad enough, and they did before you got here, he'd have leverage. A man with debt is a man who needs money. A man who needs money takes whatever deal he's offered." He paused. "He's been building a case for 2 years. "A case for what?" Clara asked. "For making an offer on this land," Ethan said. "Low enough that I'd have to take it. The property on the East Ridge, the water rights, the grazing access. If he gets all of that consolidated, he becomes the largest landowner in this part of the county," Clara finished. They looked at each other. "He's been doing the same thing to 3 other ranches," Ethan said. "I've heard talk. People struggling who weren't struggling 2 years ago. Men who started doing business with Caldwell and ended up owing him more than they started with." His jaw was set hard. "I just didn't think to look at my own books close enough to see it." "You were working the ranch alone," Clara said. "You were doing the work of 3 men. The bookkeeping fell behind because you were too busy keeping everything else alive." He looked at her. "That's not an excuse," he said. "It's not an excuse," she agreed. "It's an explanation. They're different things." He was quiet for a moment. "What would you do?" he said. "If it were your decision." She thought about it. "I'd document everything first," she said. "Every invoice, every payment, every discrepancy, all of it laid out clearly with dates and amounts. Then I'd take it to someone with legal standing, not Reverend Blaine and not the sheriff if he's Caldwell's man. Someone outside Red Hollow who can look at it without an interest in the outcome." "There's a land commissioner out of Denver," Ethan said. "I've heard he's been looking into Caldwell for a while. Couldn't prove anything. He might be able to prove it now," Clara said. Ethan looked down at the papers spread on the workbench. "This is going to make trouble," he said. "It's already trouble," Clara said. "You're just deciding whether to let it be his kind of trouble or yours." He looked at her. Not the way men had looked at her in town, not assessing, not dismissing, not looking for something to use. Just looking at her the way you look at someone you are genuinely interested in understanding. "You're not scared of this," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm terrified," she said. "But I was terrified in my mother's house, and it didn't make me any safer. Being terrified and doing nothing is just being terrified." He breathed in slowly. "All right," he said. "We document it." "We." She noticed that he'd said we. She thought he'd probably meant to say it. She didn't say anything about it. She just gathered up the papers and went back to the office to begin the documentation. And if she was holding something warm and careful in her chest again, something that felt like the word seen, but was starting to feel like something else entirely, she pushed that observation to the side and focused on the work. They spent 4 evenings building the file. Clara organized it with the same thoroughness she'd brought to the ledger's chronological cross-referenced, every discrepancy noted and sourced. Ethan sat across from her each evening and answered questions and pulled receipts from boxes in the back room, and never once told her she was doing too much, or asked if she was sure, or suggested that maybe it wasn't her business. He treated her like someone whose work was worth taking seriously. She thought about how long she'd been waiting for that, and decided not to think about it too closely, because if she did, she was going to feel something large, and she was not yet ready for large feelings. she was still getting used to small ones. On the fourth evening, when the file was complete, and they were sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and the finished documentation between them, Ethan said, "I need to tell you something." Clara looked up. "Caldwell came to town because of you," he said. "I know that. I know your mother reached out to him. I heard it from Abel Marsh at the feed store, who heard it from Caldwell's own clerk. She told him you were difficult and that she needed someone to take you off her hands. She told him you were connected to this ranch and that I was struggling with the accounts." He paused. "She gave him the opening." Clara held very still. "She didn't mean to help me," she said. "She meant to use me." "Yes." "And instead, she pointed him at your ranch, and he spent 2 years overcharging you while also trying to acquire you as a secondary objective." "That's a cold way of putting it," Ethan said. "It's an accurate way," Clara said. He nodded. She looked down at her coffee cup. "She really does believe she's doing what's best," Clara said very quietly. "That's the part that's hardest to hold. She's not doing this to be cruel. She genuinely thinks being difficult is the same as being strong. She thinks hardness is the same as love. She's never once understood the difference." "Some people don't," Ethan said. "No." Clara looked up. "But it doesn't mean you have to stay in the room with them while they figure it out." Something moved through his expression, something real and unguarded and quick. "No," he said. "It doesn't." They looked at each other across the kitchen table in the lamplight, with the documented evidence of Henry Caldwell's fraud laid out between them like a thing they'd built together. And the silence this time was different from the silence on the porch or the silence in the office. It was the silence of 2 people who have said enough true things to each other that the air between them has changed quality. Clara was the one who looked away first. "I'll have it ready to send to Denver by Friday," she said. "Friday works," he said. She picked up her coffee cup. He picked up his. Outside, the wind was moving across the ridge the way it always did this time of night, pushing down from the higher elevations, carrying the smell of pine and cold stone. She thought, "I have been in this house 2 weeks." She thought, "I have done more real work in 2 weeks than I did in 2 years in that kitchen on Main Street." She thought, "I am not going back." And then she thought nothing else at all, because thinking too far ahead was still a habit she was trying to unlearn. And right now there was coffee and lamplight, and the solid reality of a man across the table who had never once asked her to be smaller, and that was enough. That was in fact more than she had known to want. What she didn't know, what neither of them knew yet, was that by the time Friday came, Henry Caldwell would already have made his next move, and Red Hollow was about to decide once and for all which story it wanted to tell about Clara Whitmore. Show more. Henry Caldwell moved on a Wednesday. Clara found out the way most people in Red Hollow found out about things they weren't supposed to know through Abel Marsh at the feed store, who told the blacksmith who mentioned it to the woman who delivered eggs to the ranch every Thursday morning, who told Clara, with the particular breathless urgency of someone delivering news they know is going to hurt. "He's filed a complaint with the county," the egg woman said. Her name was Dottie Pierce, and she was not a malicious person, just a thorough one. "Against Mr. Walker. Says he's been harboring a woman of questionable character on the property, and that it's a disruption to the moral standing of the community. He's got 6 signatures on it, 7 if you count Reverend Blaine, which most people do." Clara held the egg crate and did not say anything for a moment. "Who are the 6? She asked. Dottie listed them. Clara recognized every name. 3 were men who did regular business with Caldwell's lumber mill. 2 were women from Margaret Whitmore's sewing circle. 1 was the owner of the boarding house on 3rd Street, the one Clara had briefly considered staying at the night she left home. "And my mother," Clara said. Dottie's face did the thing faces do when they're deciding how much truth is kindness and how much is cruelty. "She didn't sign it," she said carefully. "But she didn't speak against it either." "No," Clara said. "She wouldn't." She took the eggs inside and set them on the counter and stood in the kitchen for approximately 45 seconds, letting the information settle through her. Then she went to find Ethan. He was at the north fence. She walked out to him directly, no detour, and when he saw her face, he set down the wire stretcher he'd been using and waited. She told him. He listened without interrupting. His expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it did, a tightening, a compression, like a man doing the quiet interior work of deciding not to react the way his first instinct wanted him to. "Questionable character," he said when she finished. That's the phrase he used, apparently. "Because you're unmarried and living on a man's property." "Because I said no to him and then had somewhere else to go," Clara said. "The character part is just what he's calling it." Ethan looked at the fence post he'd been working on. Then he looked back at her. "It won't stick," he said. "There's nothing to it." "It doesn't need to stick," Clara said. "It just needs to make noise. If people are talking about my character, they're not talking about his invoices. And if the county commissioner gets a complaint filed before our documentation does, it changes the order of things." Ethan went still. "He knows we're building a case," he said. "Someone told him," Clara said. "Or he guessed. Either way, he's moving first." A silence. The wind worked through the grass around them, and a horse called from the far paddock, and the morning just kept going, indifferent to the fact that something had just shifted. "We need to send the file today," Ethan said. "I know." "Not Friday. Today." "I know," Clara said. "I already pulled it from the desk. I just need you to sign the cover letter." He looked at her for a moment. In that way he had that full, unhurried, honest attention. "You already pulled the file," he said. "I heard her wagon coming up the road," Clara said. "Dottie Pierce always has news. I've learned to be ready." The corner of his mouth moved. "Let's go sign the letter," he said. They sent it with the noon rider, a young man named Cass, who made runs between Red Hollow and Glenwood 3 times a week, and who was crucially not employed by anyone who owed Henry Caldwell a favor. Ethan paid him double the standard rate, and asked him to put it in the hands of the land commissioner's office, personally, not the general postal box. Cass looked at the sealed envelope and the expression on Ethan's face, and said "Yes, sir," and rode out before 1 o'clock. Then there was nothing to do but wait, which is always the hardest thing. Clara went back to the accounts. Not because there was anything urgent left in them, she'd brought them fully current by the end of the first week, but because having something precise and solvable in front of her kept the other part of her brain from running calculations she couldn't finish. How many people had signed that complaint? How long before it reached someone official? Whether "questionable character" was the kind of phrase that followed a woman for years in a town this size. Whether her mother was sitting in the front parlor right now, sewing, telling herself she hadn't done anything wrong. Ethan appeared in the office doorway at 2 in the afternoon. "Ride into town with me," he said. Clara looked up. "Why?" "Because if we stay up here and don't show ourselves, it looks like we're hiding," he said. "And we're not hiding." She held his gaze for a moment. "You think we should walk into it?" she said. "I think we should walk into it together," he said, "and let them look." She closed the ledger. They rode into Red Hollow side by side, which was itself a statement, and Clara was aware of the statement it made, and made it deliberately, her back straight, her hands easy on the reins. She had learned to ride in the past 2 weeks, with the quick practical competence of someone who understands that a skill is a skill, and the fastest way to acquire it is to stop being afraid of looking foolish while you learn. The main street was busy at mid-afternoon. Busy enough that their arrival was noticed. She saw the noticing happen, the small calibrations of attention, the conversations that paused the way 2 women outside the dry goods store went very still as they passed. Ethan tipped his hat to them. Clara nodded. Neither woman nodded back. They hitched outside the land office. There were a few legitimate documents Ethan needed to check on regarding the property boundary survey, and went inside, and the man behind the counter, whose name was Ferguson, and who clearly knew about the complaint, because his face went through 3 separate expressions, in the 2 seconds after the door opened, pulled himself together and helped them with professional, if slightly strangled, courtesy. While Ethan handled the survey documents, Clara stood at the counter and looked at nothing in particular and let herself be looked at. It was a thing she'd never done before. Usually, she made herself small in public spaces, pulled inward, tried to take up as little of the room as possible. Her mother had trained her to it. Be quiet. Don't draw attention. Don't make people uncomfortable with your presence. She was done with that particular piece of training. She stood in the Red Hollow land office and took up the space she occupied and did not apologize for it. It was walking out that they encountered the first direct confrontation. Frank Delman was standing on the boardwalk outside, and he had not arrived there by accident. Frank was one of Caldwell's lumber mill regulars, a heavy-set man with a red face and the particular energy of someone who has been sent to do something they've half convinced themselves is righteous. "Walker," he said, not a greeting, a placement. Ethan stopped. Clara stopped beside him. "Frank," Ethan said. "You know there's been a complaint filed," Frank said. His eyes moved to Clara and back to Ethan with the aggressive discomfort of a man who's decided a woman shouldn't be in his field of address. "Most people in town think it's warranted." "Most people in town think what Caldwell tells them to think," Ethan said. "Calm. Just observational." Frank's face got redder. "That's a hell of a thing to say." "It's an accurate thing," Ethan said. "Henry Caldwell has been overcharging this county's ranchers for 2 years and filing complaints against anyone who gets close to noticing. That's what's warranted, Frank. That's what people ought to be talking about." A few people on the boardwalk had stopped walking. The audience had assembled itself without any formal invitation the way Red Hollow audiences always did. Frank said, "You've got an unmarried woman living on your property and you're calling it work. You're asking this town to believe that's respectable." Clara said, "It is work." Frank looked at her, really looked at her for possibly the first time because she had spoken without being addressed, and that was not what she used to do. "Miss Whitmore," he started. "I manage the ranch accounts," Clara said, steady and even. "I have brought Mr. Walker's books from 4 years of disorganization into full current order. I have identified and documented over $200 in fraudulent overcharges from Caldwell Lumber, with invoices, receipts, and records to support every single claim. That documentation is currently on its way to the County Land Commissioner's office." She paused. "If the question is whether my work on this ranch is respectable, Mr. Delman, I'd like to know which part of competent bookkeeping you find objectionable." The boardwalk was very quiet. Frank opened his mouth, closed it. "I'm just saying what people are saying," he said finally. "Then maybe," Clara said, "you could say something different." She did not wait for his answer. She walked to where the horses were hitched and untied her reins and stood holding them, and after a moment, Ethan was beside her, and she could feel the particular quality of his presence, not protective in the way of a wall, not hovering in the way of someone expecting her to need rescuing. Just present. Just there the way a person stands beside someone they trust. They rode back in the same silence they'd ridden in with, but it was a different silence now. Fuller, warmer. "You didn't need me to say anything," Ethan said when they were out of town. "I know," Clara said, "but I'm glad you were there." He nodded once. They rode the rest of the way home without talking, and neither of them needed to. The response from Denver came faster than expected. 12 days after they sent the file, a man named Ira Hollis rode up to the Walker Ranch on a government horse with a badge from the Colorado Land Commissioner's office and a letter requesting Ethan's presence at a formal inquiry into the business practices of Henry Caldwell and Associates. The inquiry was scheduled for 3 weeks out in Glenwood Springs before a panel that included 2 state judges and a federal land examiner. Clara read the letter twice. "They already knew," she said. "They'd been building toward this. Our file was the last piece." Ethan looked at the letter over her shoulder. "How can you tell?" "Because they scheduled it in 3 weeks, not 3 months," she said. "If they were starting from nothing, they'd need more time. They already have the rest of the case built. They were waiting for documentation from inside Caldwell's supply chain, and we gave it to them." Ethan sat down. He sat down in the kitchen chair slowly, with the weight of a man who has been standing up under something heavy for a long time and has just been told he's allowed to put it down for a moment. 3 years, he said. I've been watching that man move through this county for 3 years, and I knew something was wrong, and I couldn't—" He stopped. "I couldn't get a hand on it." "You were doing it alone," Clara said. "You can't watch the edges of things when you're in the middle of running them." He looked up at her. "You keep saying that," he said, "because you keep blaming yourself for not doing the work of 3 people simultaneously," she said. "One person can't." He was quiet for a moment. "My brother would have seen it," he said. "James was sharper than me about people. He'd have known what Caldwell was doing inside of 6 months. "James isn't here," Clara said, gently but directly. "You are, and you did see it. Maybe not as fast as he would have, but you saw it, and you let someone help you, and now there's a federal inquiry." She sat down across from him. "That counts for something." He looked at his hands. "He'd have liked you," Ethan said. "James. He always respected people who were practical, who didn't fuss around about things." Clara felt something shift quietly in her chest. "Tell me about him," she said. So Ethan did. He talked about James the way people talk about someone they've grieved long enough to also remember with joy, a young man who could fix any mechanical thing he put his hands to, who sang off-key when he thought nobody was listening, who made friends everywhere he went with the easy open warmth that Ethan had never quite managed, who had stood at the edge of this ridge on a clear day and said, "This place is going to be something, Ethan, you wait." Clara listened. She didn't offer anything or redirect. She just listened the way she'd learned to listen, working through the accounts with her full attention, letting the information land instead of filtering it. When Ethan was done, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I haven't talked about him much since." "I know," Clara said. "It shows, not in a bad way. Just in the way of a person carrying something they haven't put words to yet." He looked at her. "You're very direct," he said. "My mother always told me that was a flaw." "It's not a flaw," he said. It was such a plain, simple statement, not emphatic, not performed. Just stated the way you state a fact you've thought about and are confident of. Clara looked at the government letter on the table between them. "What do you think Caldwell will do when he hears about the inquiry?" she said. Ethan's expression settled back into something harder. "He'll move on Red Hollow," he said, "before the inquiry date. He'll try to shore up his position here, collect on any debts he can call in, maybe try to renegotiate the properties he's been working toward. And he'll come at you and me again. Harder this time." "How hard?" Clara said. "Hard enough to make us want to settle quietly," Ethan said. "Offer me a price on the land. Offer you—" He paused, choosing the words carefully. "Something that looks like a way out to make you choose between the inquiry and whatever he thinks you want more." Clara thought about that. "He thinks I want security," she said. "He thinks because I came from my mother's house with $4.60 that I'll trade anything for stability." "That's what he thinks," Ethan said. "He hasn't been watching close enough," Clara said. She hadn't meant it to come out the way it did, flat and certain, and with an edge on it. But it came out that way, and Ethan looked at her when it did, and there was something in his expression that was not quite a smile, but was warmer than any expression she had a name for yet. "No," he said. "He hasn't." Caldwell came to the ranch 4 days later. He didn't send someone. He came himself, which meant he was rattled, which meant the inquiry notice had reached him, and he was doing the math. And the math wasn't adding up the way he'd planned. He came in the middle of the afternoon, which was when he assumed Ethan would be out on the property, and Clara would be in the house alone. He had misjudged because Ethan was 20 yards from the house replacing a hinge on the barn door when the wagon came up the road, and he walked to the front of the property, and was standing in the yard when Caldwell stepped down. Clara came out of the house behind him. She stood 1 step off the porch and waited. Caldwell looked between them. He took approximately 2 seconds to adjust the version of this conversation he'd prepared. "Walker," he said, "I think we need to talk." "All right," Ethan said. "Talk?" Caldwell glanced at Clara. "Privately." "Whatever you've got to say to me, you can say in front of Miss Whitmore," Ethan said. "She manages the ranch accounts. Anything affecting this property affects her work." Caldwell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He was a man who was good at adjusting. Clara saw not rattled easily, not given to obvious tells. But there were tells if you knew how to look. The slight widening of the eyes before they steadied. The one moment before he placed his hat on his left hand instead of his right. "I've heard there's been some questions raised about my business dealings," Caldwell said. The tone was companionable. Careful. The tone of a man who was reasonably certain he was still in control of the situation. "I think there's been some confusion about the invoice records. Understandable, you've been running this place alone for a while. Paperwork gets complicated. I'm prepared to come to an arrangement. Settle any discrepancy, call it an accounting error, no harm done." $230, Ethan said. "That's not an accounting error. That's a method." Caldwell's eyes moved to Clara. "You've been doing some careful reading, Miss Whitmore," he said, and now the companionable tone had a new note underneath it. Not threatening exactly. Something adjacent to threatening that kept its hands in its pockets. "I wonder if you fully understand what you've put in motion." "I understand it completely," Clara said. "That's why I did it. There are people in this town," Caldwell said, still looking at her, "who have a great deal of influence over how a woman in your position is perceived. A word here, a word there. It's a small county. A woman who makes powerful men uncomfortable tends to find that small towns have long memories." "Is that a threat, Mr. Caldwell?" Clara asked. "It's an observation," he said. "I'm trying to help you understand the situation you're in before it becomes more difficult than it needs to be." "I appreciate your concern," Clara said, "but I'd like you to hear an observation of mine in return." She looked at him directly, not with anger, not with performance, just with the clear level attention of someone who has done the arithmetic and is reading out the result. "You've filed a complaint against this ranch using my name. You've overcharged every supplier in your supply chain and used the resulting debt to leverage property purchases below value. You've done it to at least 5 ranches in this county that I can document and probably more that I haven't gotten to yet. The Land Commissioner's office now has everything I can document. And I will tell you, Mr. Caldwell, in the same spirit of helpfulness you've just offered me, it is a great deal of documentation." The yard went quiet. Caldwell looked at her for a long moment. Something had changed in his face. The adjustment process had stopped, and what was underneath it was harder and colder and more real than the careful manager he usually showed the world. "Your mother told me you were stubborn," he said. "My mother was right about more than she knew," Clara said. He turned back to Ethan. "Last offer," he said, and the reasonable tone was gone now, stripped off like a mask that had gotten too heavy to hold. "I'll pay the $230, settle the complaint, and pay a fair price for this property. You'll be clear of debt, clear of this fight, and you can start somewhere easier." A pause. "Or you can take this to Glenwood and spend the next 2 years in legal proceedings against a man who has been in this county for 30 years and has friends in every corner of it." Ethan looked at him for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "Get off my property, Henry." Not angry, not loud, just final. The tone of a man who has made a decision that is not going to unmake itself regardless of what comes next. Caldwell held his gaze for another beat. Then he put his hat back on. He turned and he walked to his wagon and he climbed up and he drove out the way he'd come in, and neither Clara nor Ethan said anything until the sound of the wheels had faded entirely. Then Ethan let out a slow breath. "He's going to move against the other ranchers," he said. "Try to lock in agreements before the inquiry." "I know," Clara said. "We need to warn them." He looked at her. "That means going back into town, knocking on doors, asking people who didn't defend you on that boardwalk to listen to you now." "Yes," Clara said. "It does. Some of them won't. Some of them will," she said. "And that's enough to start." He studied her face. She let him look. "You were scared of your own shadow when you came here," he said. "Not in a bad way, just you were carrying about 6 years' worth of someone else's opinion of you." "I know what I was," Clara said. "I know you know," he said. "I'm just saying I noticed the difference, is all." She held his gaze. "Someone told me everyone needs to be seen," she said. Turns out they were right. Something in his face went very quiet, very still. The way things go still when they have stopped being careful about what they're showing. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. What happened next was not dramatic. She did not reach for him, and he did not reach for her. What happened was simply that they stood in the yard in the afternoon light and looked at each other, and the distance between them, which had been decreasing by small and almost imperceptible degrees for 3 weeks, became a different kind of distance, the kind that is not absence but potential. The kind that has weight and warmth and the specific gravity of two people who have decided without words that they are not going to pretend anymore, that this is only about the accounts. Then Ethan said, "I'll saddle both horses." "I'll get my jacket," Clara said, and they went to warn their neighbors. They spent the rest of the afternoon and into the early evening riding from ranch to ranch. Some doors opened wide. Tom Aldridge, whose beef operation sat 2 ridges north, had been suspicious of Caldwell's invoices for months, and listened to what Clara had put together with the focused attention of a man who has been waiting for someone to confirm what he already believed. His wife Ruth looked at Clara with an expression that was not quite apology, but was the closest thing to it that pride would allow, and pressed her hands and said, "You come back whenever you need to, honey. Any time." Other doors opened narrower. Jeb Morrow, whose sheep operation sat along the eastern creek, was Caldwell's man through and through, or believed he was, and told them flatly that he wanted no part of any inquiry, and asked them to leave before his supper got cold. His wife met Clara's eyes through the window as they rode away with a look that said she had opinions her husband didn't know about. 2 families listened. 2 didn't. One asked to see the documentation and spent 40 minutes going through it at the kitchen table, while Ethan stood by the horses, and Clara answered questions with the patient precision of someone who had built the file herself and could defend every number in it. When they finally turned back toward the black pine, the sky was well into dark, and they were both tired in the deep, good way of people who have done something that mattered. 3 out of 5, Clara said. 4, Ethan said. Morrow's wife is going to tell him he's wrong. I saw her face. Clara looked at him. You notice that, she said. I notice things, he said. I'm quiet, not inattentive. She laughed. It surprised her, the laugh, because it came before she could think about it, clean and genuine, from somewhere she hadn't accessed in so long she'd half forgotten it was there. Ethan looked at her when she laughed, not startled exactly, but attentive in that particular way of his, like someone filing away a sound they want to remember. They rode the last mile home in a comfortable quiet, and when they got back to the ranch, Clara made supper from what was in the kitchen. Nothing elaborate. Just what was there. Beans and cornbread, and the last of the smoked ham, and they ate it together at the kitchen table, and did not talk much and did not need to. After Clara stood at the kitchen window washing the dishes, and Ethan sat at the table with his coffee, and she thought about everything that had happened since the morning of June the 3rd, the dropped basket, the boardwalk, the bag with $4.60, the room with the iron latch, the ledgers, the file, Caldwell in the yard, Tom Aldridge's kitchen, Ruth's hands pressing hers, and she thought that if you had told her 6 weeks ago that this is where she would be, and this is who she would be, in it, she would not have believed you. Not because it was beyond imagining, because she had never let herself imagine. Clara, Ethan said. She turned around. He was looking at her with the full, quiet attention she'd come to know was not casual for him, that when Ethan Walker looked at something that way, he was about to say something real. Whatever happens at the inquiry, he said. Whatever Caldwell does between now and then. I want you to know that when I offered you a room and honest work, I was telling the truth. That was what I had. That's what I meant. She waited. And somewhere between then and now, he said, it became more than that. For me. He stopped. I'm not good at this kind of talking. I want you to know that up front. I know you're not, she said. You're doing fine. He looked at her. I don't want you here because it's useful, he said. I want you here because this place it's different when you're in it. I'm different. He said it the way he said most things, without performance, without decoration. Just the plain words around a plain truth. And I don't know what that means yet, but I know I didn't want to not say it. Clara looked at him across the kitchen. This careful, solitary, difficult, decent man who had said one true thing on a boardwalk and meant every word of it. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah." "I know," she said. He breathed in slowly. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. She turned back to the dishes. He picked up his coffee cup. Outside, the wind moved down the ridge and the horses shifted in the barn, and Red Hollow sat 3 miles below them, doing whatever Red Hollow did at 10 o'clock at night, and neither of them said anything else, because nothing else needed saying right now. There was time. There was more time ahead of them than behind, and that itself was something new, the feeling of a future that hadn't been foreclosed, the feeling of space. The inquiry was 17 days away, and somewhere down the mountain, Henry Caldwell was planning his next move. But he had not counted on something. He had built his strategy around a woman who believed she was worth nothing, a woman who could be managed by a mother purchased by a man and scattered by a word. He had not accounted for who Clara Whitmore had become. He was about to find out. The 17 days before the inquiry did not pass quietly. Caldwell made sure of that. The first thing he did was call in every debt he could reach. Not financial debts, social ones. The kind that accumulate in small towns over 30 years of calculated generosity of favors extended with the particular precision of a man who always intended to collect. He called on the men who had eaten at his table, and the women whose husbands depended on his lumber mill for contracts, and the merchants whose storefronts sat on land. He technically held paper on, and he reminded them in his smooth and reasonable way that loyalty was a form of currency, and the time had come to spend some. Within 4 days, Clara and Ethan rode into Red Hollow and felt the shift like a change in weather. Conversations stopped when they passed. The dry goods merchant, who had been cordial enough the week before, suddenly had a problem with their account that needed reviewing before he could fill their order. 2 women from the sewing circle crossed the street rather than pass them on the boardwalk. "He's been busy," Ethan said, watching the street with the level eyes of a man cataloging information rather than taking offense. "He's scared," Clara said. "Scared men get busy." "Scared men are also dangerous," Ethan said. "I know," she said. "I grew up with a scared woman. I know exactly what scared looks like when it starts making decisions." What came next was the letter. It arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday, 7 days before the inquiry, delivered, not by Cass the regular writer, but by a man Clara had never seen before. Well-dressed professional, clearly not from Red Hollow. He handed Ethan an envelope with the name of a Denver law firm printed on the front, tipped his hat with the practiced courtesy of a man who delivers unpleasant things for a living, and rode back the way he'd come. Ethan brought it inside and set it on the kitchen table, and they both looked at it for a moment before Clara picked it up and opened it. She read it once quickly, then again slowly. "He's claiming the ranch," she said. Ethan went absolutely still. "He's filed a counter-complaint with the state land office," Clara said, eyes moving through the document. "He's claiming the original property survey from 1879 was fraudulent. He says the boundary markers were moved before your father purchased the land, and that the actual acreage is significantly less than recorded. He's got an affidavit from a surveyor man named Purcell out of Colorado Springs, saying the current property line encroaches on what should have been Caldwell's eastern acquisition." She set the letter down. "If the claim holds," she said, "you lose roughly 40% of the grazing land, the northern water access, and the approach road to the upper ridge." Ethan sat down. Not with the heaviness of defeat, with the deliberate, controlled movement of a man making sure he was planted solidly before he thought through what he was looking at. "Purcell," he said. "I don't know that name." "He's not local," Clara said. "That's deliberate. A local surveyor would have records, would know the history of the land, might not sign an affidavit that couldn't survive scrutiny. Someone from Colorado Springs doesn't know the territory, and his name isn't in any of the county records I've worked through." She picked up the letter again, scanning. "But the original survey from 1879 is. I've seen the references to it in the boundary documentation from the land office. Ethan is the original survey filed anywhere on this property. He was quiet for a moment. My father's papers, he said slowly. There's a box in the back room. I haven't been through it since he died. They found it in 40 minutes of careful searching through a battered cedar box that smelled of pipe tobacco and old paperland deeds, receipts, correspondence, and underneath all of it, folded and creased with age, the original property survey from August of 1879. Hand-drawn, signed by the original surveyor with boundary markers described in specific geographical terms that referenced creek bends and rock formations, and a particular stand of ponderosa pine on the northeast corner. Clara spread it on the desk and compared it against the counter-complaint's affidavit point by point. The survey is legitimate, she said. The boundary descriptions are specific, and they're consistent with the current property markers. Purcell's affidavit claims the northeast marker was moved, but the 1879 survey describes the boundary by reference to the ponderosa stand, and those trees don't move. She looked up. If the ponderosa stand is still where it was in 1879, it's still there, Ethan said. I've ridden that corner 100 times. Then Purcell's affidavit is false, Clara said. He's claiming a boundary shift that the geological record contradicts. She paused. We need someone to verify it. An independent surveyor who can look at the 1879 document and confirm the ponderosa markers haven't moved. There's a man in Glenwood, Ethan said. Retired county surveyor named Hatch. He's been in this region for 30 years. He'd know the territory. Can you reach him before the inquiry? I can ride out tomorrow morning. Ride tonight, Clara said. We have 7 days. He looked at her. Tonight, he agreed. He left at dusk. Clara stood on the porch and watched him ride down the road toward Glenwood and then went back inside and spread everything on the desk. The 1879 survey, the counter-complaint, the Purcell affidavit, and the documentation they'd already built against Caldwell's invoicing fraud, and began working through how it all connected. She worked until past midnight. At some point she made coffee and forgot to drink it. At some point, the lamp oil burned low, and she tilted the lamp and kept going. She was building something in her head, not just the documented case, but the shape of it, the way all the pieces fit into a pattern that told a story, and the story was more comprehensive than even she had realized. Caldwell hadn't just been overcharging suppliers. He had been doing it selectively, targeting ranches that he had prior intelligence on. Ranches with accounts in disarray with sole operators who had no one to help them catch discrepancies with properties that sat along specific corridors of land. When she mapped his acquisition targets against the overcharging pattern, they weren't random. They formed a line from the eastern ridge through the valley floor and up toward the Black Pine, and if you owned all of it, you controlled the water access for the entire northern quarter of the county. It wasn't just greed, it was strategy. And it had been 20 years in the making. She sat back in the chair and pressed her hands flat on the desk and stared at the map she'd drawn on the back of a blank invoice and thought about a man who had spent 2 decades building toward something and who was now watching it come apart because a woman he'd dismissed as a pawn had turned out to be something else entirely. Then she picked up her pen and kept working. Ethan came back the following evening with Hatch in tow, a small, wiry man in his 60s, with the permanently squinting eyes of someone who spent his life reading small distances carefully. He shook Clara's hand with a firm, brief grip, sat down at the desk, and read the 1879 survey with the focused attention of a man who spoke the language fluently. I know this survey, he said after 5 minutes. Donaldson did it. Good man. Dead now, but good. His notation method is distinctive. He tapped a corner of the document. He always described boundary markers with 3 independent reference points. See here, creek bed rock formation and the ponderosa stand. Not 1, 3. Any 2 of them would establish the boundary if the third was ever disturbed. He looked at the Purcell affidavit. This gentleman claims the northeast marker was moved, but he only provides 1 reference point for his revised boundary, because the other 2 don't support his claim. Can you put that in writing? Clara asked. I can do better than that, Hatch said. I'll ride the boundary tomorrow morning and make a current survey. If those ponderosa trees are where Donaldson put them, In 1879, and I expect they are, because ponderosa pine in this elevation doesn't move much in 7 years. Then I can certify under oath that the current property line is consistent with the original survey, and Purcell's affidavit is worthless. We need it by Thursday, Clara said. I'll have it Wednesday, Hatch said. I'm retired. I don't have anything else to do. He said it dry and simple, and Clara laughed, and Ethan looked between them with an expression of mild bewilderment, and Hatch helped himself to the coffee that Clara offered and stayed for supper, and turned out to be the best company either of them had had in weeks. After Hatch went to bed in the spare room, Clara and Ethan sat at the kitchen table with the new map she'd drawn the acquisition corridor. The target ranches, the water access pattern, all of it laid out in the spare clear hand she'd developed through months of accounting work. This is bigger than overcharging, Ethan said. Yes, Clara said. He's been building toward a land consolidation that would give him effective control of northern county water rights. The overcharging was the mechanism for creating debt he could then leverage into below-value property purchases. But the goal was always the land. Ethan studied the map. Tom Aldridge's property, he said, pointing. Right in the middle of the corridor. And the Morrow sheep operation at the southern end, Clara said. And 3 others I've identified from the invoice records. Each one with documented overcharging going back at least 2 years. Each one along this line. And mine at the top, Ethan said. Because the Black Pine water rights feed everything below it. Without your property, the corridor breaks, Clara said. The eastern and western sections don't connect. He can't control the water flow without the Black Pine. That's why he came after you specifically. That's why he used my mother to get intelligence on your accounts. You were the keystone. Ethan sat back in his chair. He's been planning this since before my brother died, he said slowly. Since before your father died, I think, Clara said. The original approach to your family's property, I found a reference in the land office records, 1980-81. He made an offer. Your father turned it down. Ethan's jaw tightened. I didn't know that. He didn't want you to know, Clara said. He wanted you isolated, struggling with the accounts, managing the ranch alone, not talking to your neighbors enough to compare notes. Isolated people make easier targets. It almost worked, Ethan said. Almost, Clara said. He looked at the map. Then he looked at her. You built all of this tonight, he said. I had good source material, she said. You built the ranch that made it possible. Hatch is going to give us the survey certification. The ranchers who listened to us gave us the corroborating accounts. She looked at the map. Nobody built this alone. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. I always answer honestly, she said. I know you do, he said. That's why I'm asking. He looked at his hands on the table. After the inquiry, after this is settled, or even if it doesn't settle the way we want it to, what do you want? Not for the ranch, not for the case, for you. Clara looked at him. It was the question nobody had ever asked her. Not her mother, not anyone in Red Hollow, not a single person in her 20 years of working and managing and keeping things running had sat across a table from her and asked what she wanted for herself. She felt the weight of it. The specific, unfamiliar gravity of being asked something real. I want to keep doing work that matters, she said. I want to use what I'm good at. I want to... She stopped, started again. I want to not be managed, she said. By anyone. Not my mother, not a man who sees me as furniture, not circumstances. I want to make choices. She paused. I want this. She looked around the kitchen, the desk in the next room, the papers on the table, the map she'd drawn at midnight while the oil burned low. Not because I have nowhere else to go, because this is where I choose to be. Ethan held her gaze. Then stay, he said. Simply, directly. The way he said everything. Not as an employee, not as someone with a room and a wage who can leave when it gets hard. Stay because you choose it. She looked at him across the kitchen table. This man who had told her every true thing he knew how to tell, who had stood beside her on the boardwalk and in the yard, and on the road to every neighbor's door, who had ridden to Glenwood at dusk without being asked, because she'd said tonight, and he'd trusted her judgment. "I choose it," she said. He breathed in slowly. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers, just briefly, just for a moment, just enough to be real, and then he took it back and looked at the map and said, "We should get some sleep before Hatch wants to start on the boundary survey at first light." "He strikes me as a 4:30 man," Clara said. "God help us," Ethan said. He was in fact a 4:15 man, and he appeared in the kitchen at that hour, looking fully alert and slightly amused by the fact that both Clara and Ethan were already up and had coffee ready, and the three of them rode the boundary together in the cold early morning. And the Ponderosa stand was exactly where Donaldson had placed it in August of 1879, 4 trees still standing in the northeast corner of the property, like they'd been put there specifically to contradict a fraudulent affidavit 7 years in the future. Hatch measured, noted, photographed the location with a small sketch, compared his measurements against the 1879 survey 4 separate times. Then he looked up at Ethan and said, "Purcell either measured wrong or lied. Given the context, I know which one I'd bet on." "Which would you put in the written certification?" Clara asked. "Measured incorrectly," Hatch said, which in this case amounts to the same thing, but gives the panel fewer things to argue about procedure over. He folded his measuring tape. "I'll have the document to you by tomorrow afternoon." The document arrived as promised, and Clara added it to the file, and the file was now 3 inches thick and documented with the kind of thoroughness that doesn't leave a lot of room for counter-argument. Then Margaret Whitmore came to the ranch. Clara saw her coming from the front window. Her mother's particular upright posture on the wagon seat, the way Margaret always held the reins slightly too tight, as if she expected the horse to make a decision she hadn't approved. She watched the wagon come up the road and felt all the complicated things she always felt when she saw her mother from a distance. The old pull of wanting the older habit of bracing, and underneath both of those, something new. Something that was not quite ready to be named, but was something in the neighborhood of pity. She went to the door before her mother could knock. They looked at each other through the open doorway. Margaret Whitmore looked older than she had 6 weeks ago. Not dramatically so, she was still the composed, straight-backed woman she had always been, but there were things around her eyes that hadn't been there before, and her hands on her bag were not quite steady. "Clara," she said. "Mama," Clara said. A beat. "May I come in?" Margaret asked. Clara stepped back from the door. Margaret came inside and stood in the kitchen and looked around it with the careful, calibrated attention she applied to everything, noting, assessing, filing. Clara watched her mother look at the desk visible through the office door, the papers on the kitchen table, the coffee cups that indicated 2 people had been here this morning. "You've made yourself at home," Margaret said. "Margaret." "I've made a home," Clara said. The distinction was not accidental, and from the slight tightening around her mother's mouth, Margaret heard it. "Sit down, Mama," Clara said. "I'll make coffee." Margaret sat. Clara made coffee. Neither of them spoke while the water heated, and the silence had a different quality than the silences of Clara's childhood. Those had been silences she'd been responsible for filling, silences that had edges on them. This one was just a silence. 2 women in a kitchen. Clara set the cups on the table and sat across from her mother and waited. Margaret wrapped both hands around her cup. She looked down at it. "Henry Caldwell came to see me," she said. Clara was quiet. "3 days ago," Margaret said. "He told me what you'd done, the documentation, the inquiry, the surveyor." She paused. "He wasn't kind about it." "He's not a kind man," Clara said. "No." Something moved across her mother's face. "I'm beginning to understand that." Clara said nothing. She was not going to make this easier for her mother than it needed to be. Not out of cruelty, because Margaret Whitmore had lived her whole life having things made easier for her than they should have been, things smoothed over and absorbed and managed by the daughter she'd trained to do it, And that particular habit had consequences, and some of them were sitting across this table right now. He implied, Margaret said carefully, that I had provided him with information that he then used to file claims against this property, and against your character. She looked up. I want you to know that I did not intend. What did you tell him, Mama? Clara asked. Quiet. Direct. Margaret held her gaze. I told him the Walker accounts were in disarray, she said. He asked about the financial situation on the ranch. I thought he was simply asking as a businessman. I told him what I knew, which was that you'd mentioned the accounts were behind. She paused. And I told him that you were becoming, that you seemed to be settling in here in a way I didn't think was proper, and that perhaps a formal arrangement. You gave him the information he needed to build a legal claim against this land, Clara said. I didn't know that's what he'd do with it. Didn't you? Clara said. The question sat between them without flinching. Margaret looked down at her coffee. Her jaw was working in the way it did when she was holding something in that wanted to come out a different shape than the one it actually was. I was trying to protect you, she said. I know you believe that, Clara said. I've spent 20 years watching you believe that. The problem, Mama, is that your version of protecting me was always the same as your version of controlling me, and you never found a way to tell the difference. Her mother's eyes came up. There was something in them Clara had never seen before, or had seen so rarely she'd stopped looking for it. Something undefended. I was scared, Margaret said. I've been scared since your father died. I looked at you and I saw someone who could be hurt by the world in all the ways I couldn't prevent, and I... She stopped. Her voice was not quite steady. I know what I did. I know the way I did it was wrong. But I need you to know the thing underneath it was not, I was not trying to diminish you. I was trying to hold on to me, Clara said. Margaret closed her mouth. By making me believe I couldn't survive without you, Clara said. I understand the arithmetic, Mama. I do. I understand you were scared, and I understand you found a way to manage that scared that made sense to you. But the way you managed it was to teach me I was less than I was. For 20 years you told me I was ordinary and incapable and difficult and not enough, and... Her voice caught. She let it catch. She didn't try to smooth it over. And I believed you. For most of those 20 years, I believed you completely. Margaret pressed her lips together. Her eyes were bright. I came here to tell you that I'm sorry, she said. Clara looked at her mother. She looked at the woman who had read her fairy tales with voices for all the characters, who had pulled her close after nightmares and smelled like lavender and certainty, who had become after grief remade her something harder and more frightened and less able to reach across the distance to her own child. I hear you, Clara said. Margaret wiped her eye with the precise, contained gesture of a woman who had decided long ago that crying in front of others was a kind of defeat. That's not forgiveness, she said. No, Clara said. It's not. Not yet. She wrapped her own hands around her coffee cup. But I'm not hard against you, Mama. I want you to know that. I'm not sitting here in hatred. I'm sitting here in the truth of what happened. And I need you to be in it with me, not around it. She paused. Can you do that? Her mother looked at her for a long moment. I don't know, she said with the particular honesty of a woman who has just stopped performing. But I'd like to try. The kitchen was very quiet. All right, Clara said. They finished their coffee. Margaret asked careful questions about the inquiry, not defensive ones, just questions listening when Clara answered. When Clara explained the full scope of what Caldwell had been building across the county, Margaret's expression did something unfamiliar. It went still with the particular stillness of a person who has just understood they were used. He knew I would talk, Margaret said flatly. He knew I'd be too proud to ask what he actually wanted with the information. He knew I'd tell him what I knew about you because I was... She stopped. Because you were trying to place me somewhere safe, Clara said. And he offered to be safe. Yes. The word was compressed to about half its normal size. He does that, Clara said. He looks for what people want most and offers it. It's how he operates." She paused. "You're not the only one he fooled. He fooled ranchers who'd been doing business for 30 years. He almost fooled Ethan." She looked at her mother. "He didn't count on you sending me somewhere I'd be able to see the books." Margaret looked up. "That's not what I intended," she said. "I know," Clara said, "but it's what happened." Something shifted in her mother's face, not quite humor, but something in that family. The capacity to see the irony of things which Clara remembered from childhood, which she had thought was gone. "Your father would have found it funny," Margaret said. "He would have," Clara agreed. They sat with that for a moment, with the ghost of a decent man who had loved them both and been loved by them both, and whose absence had sent them spinning in opposite directions for 7 years. "I want to come to the inquiry," Margaret said, "if you'll allow it." Clara looked at her. "Why?" "Because I know what I told him, and I know when I told him, and I know what he did with it," Margaret said, with the precise, controlled tone of a woman who has made a decision and is committed to it. "And because if you're going to stand up in that room in Glenwood Springs and tell the truth about Henry Caldwell, your mother should be standing with you." Clara held her gaze. "You'd have to say what you told him," she said. "All of it. Under oath if they ask, including the things that don't reflect well." "I know that," Margaret said. "The town will talk," Clara said. "Some of the things they'll say won't be kind." "The town talks regardless," Margaret said. "At least this time they'll be talking about something true." Clara breathed in slowly. "I'll ask Ethan," she said. "It's his inquiry." "Of course," Margaret said. She pushed back her chair and stood and picked up her bag, and stood for a moment at the kitchen table, looking at her daughter with the undefended eyes she'd arrived with. "You look well," she said. "You look like yourself. I don't know if I ever told you what that looked like." Clara felt the back of her throat tighten. "You didn't," she said, "but I'm finding out." Margaret nodded once. She walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame. "He said you were manageable," she said. "Caldwell, when he first came to me. He said you were a quiet girl who would come around with the right handling." Her jaw set. "I should have known then. You were never manageable. You were just patient." She left before Clara could answer. Clara stood in the kitchen for a long time after the wagon sounds faded. Then she walked to the office doorway and stood looking at the desk and the papers and the 3-inch file and the map with the acquisition corridor drawn out in her own hand. And she thought about patient. She had been patient. For 20 years she had been very, very patient, pressing down the anger and the want and the knowledge that she was worth more than the room she'd been given, and she had done it because she hadn't known what else to do. And then one evening, a man on a bay horse had stopped at the end of a street and offered her something else, and she had taken it, and here she was. She heard Ethan's boots on the porch and turned. He came in and read her face in the way he'd learned to read it, not all of it, but enough. "Your mother," he said. "My mother," she said. "How'd it go?" "She wants to come to the inquiry," Clara said. "She knows what she told Caldwell and when. It would corroborate the timeline." Ethan thought about that. "Would it hurt you?" he asked. "Having her there?" "I don't know," Clara said honestly. "But I think it's the right thing. And she asked to do the right thing, which is that's new for her. I don't want to say no to it." He nodded. "Then she comes," he said. 3 days before the inquiry, Caldwell made his final move on Red Hollow. He called a town meeting, announced it through the Reverend, which gave it a credibility. It didn't earn on its own, and stood in the meeting hall and gave a speech about community, about the danger of outsiders and agitators and women who inserted themselves into men's business for personal gain, and about the importance of Red Hollow standing together against those who would use legal proceedings to tear apart what its citizens had built. It was a good speech. He was good at speeches. Several people in the hall were nodding by the time he was half done. Then Tom Aldridge stood up. "He's been overcharging my ranch for 2 years," Tom said into the middle of Caldwell's closing remarks. "I've seen the documentation. It's solid. He looked around the room. How many of you have done supply business with Caldwell Lumber in the last 3 years? How many of you have actually compared his invoices to what Donovan's charges out of Glenwood? A silence. Then Jeb Morrow's wife, Jeb Morrow, who had told them he wanted no part of any inquiry, stood up. I have, she said. I went through our invoices last week. We've been overcharged on every order for 18 months. She looked at her husband. Tell them, Jeb. Jeb Morrow looked like a man who would have preferred not to be in this room. But he looked at his wife's face, and he stood up. It's true, he said shortly. Every order. The room changed. Clara was not there for the town meeting. She had not been invited and would not have gone if she had been the time for trying to persuade Red Hollow had passed. But Tom Aldridge's wife Ruth came to the ranch the next morning and told her everything that had happened, finishing with the information that by the end of the meeting, 4 more families had stood and said they'd been overcharged, and Caldwell had left the hall before the discussion ended. He walked out, Ruth said. Just picked up his hat and walked out. Like a man who's done the math and knows the numbers aren't going to change. They're not, Clara said. Ruth looked at her. You did this? She said. We did it, Clara said. No, honey. Ruth put her hand on Clara's arm. I like Ethan Walker fine. But you did this. He had the land and the anger and the right. You had the file. Clara looked at Ruth's hand on her arm. This woman who had said you come back whenever you need to. Honey, who had watched her with something not quite apology but close, who was standing in her kitchen, now saying something that was landing in a place Clara was still learning to let things land. Thank you, Clara said. Don't thank me, Ruth said. Just come to town without bracing yourself like you're walking into a fight. You've earned the street. The morning of the inquiry, Clara was up at 4. She was dressed and at the desk by 4:30, going through the file one last time, not because anything needed changing, but because she needed to hold it in her hands and know every part of it and walk into that room in Glenwood Springs with the absolute certainty of someone who has done the work completely. Ethan appeared in the office doorway at 5. He looked at her. She looked at him. Ready? He said. She closed the file. Since about 3 weeks ago, she said. He almost smiled. Not quite, but close. Then let's go finish it. They rode to Glenwood Springs in a group that had assembled itself without any formal organization. Ethan and Clara at the front, Tom Aldridge and his wife behind 3 other ranch families in wagons behind them, and Margaret Whitmore in her own wagon at the rear, alone keeping a precise distance that was not cold, but was honest about what it was, a beginning, not an arrival. The land commissioner's hearing room was formal and high-ceilinged, and smelled of wood smoke and old paper. The panel consisted of 2 state judges and the federal land examiner who had Clara now knew been building toward this for 2 years, and was not even slightly neutral on the question of Henry Caldwell's business practices. Caldwell was already there when they arrived. He was sitting with 2 lawyers and a man Clara assumed was Purcell, a heavy-set, nervous-looking man who kept adjusting the papers in front of him. Caldwell looked at Clara when she walked in. Not at Ethan. At Clara. It was a long look, measured and cold, the look of a man recalculating something. She met it and held it and did not look away until he did. Then she sat down, put the file on the table in front of her, and folded her hands on top of it. The panel called the hearing to order. Ethan presented first the property history, the original survey, Hatch's certification. His testimony was steady and clear, and entirely without ornamentation, which suited it. Facts land better without decoration. Clara presented second, and the room changed when she did. Not dramatically, not loudly, but she felt the shift, the panel's attention sharpening the other ranchers in the gallery sitting forward slightly, the particular quality of attention that a room gives to someone who knows exactly what they're talking about. She laid out the invoice pattern first. Each ranch, each overcharge percentage, each date, each payment. She laid out the acquisition corridor map, her map hand-drawn, clearly sourced, and explained the water rights logic. She presented Hatch's boundary certification and walked the panel through why Purcell's affidavit was inconsistent with the geological record. She was precise and unhurried and did not perform certainty, She didn't have or had certainty she did. When she was done, one of the judges looked at Caldwell's lawyers and said, "Does your client wish to respond to the invoice documentation?" Caldwell's lead lawyer began a response about accounting inconsistencies and good faith business practices and the unfortunate tendency of partial records to create misleading impressions. One of the judges interrupted him. "The documentation is not partial," the judge said. "It is cross-referenced across 6 independent suppliers, 7 ranch accounts, and 2 years of purchase records. When you say partial, what specifically are you suggesting is missing?" Caldwell's lawyer did not have a good answer. Margaret testified in the afternoon. She sat in the chair in front of the panel with the straight back and composed face of a woman who had decided exactly how much of the truth she was going to tell, and then told all of it. She described what Caldwell had asked her, what she had said, when she had said it. She did not minimize or excuse or frame it more favorably than it was. When she was done, she walked back to her seat in the gallery, and as she passed Clara, she paused just for a moment and put her hand briefly on Clara's shoulder. Clara did not move, but she felt it. Hatch testified last, and his testimony on the boundary survey was precise and unassailable, and delivered with the dry confidence of a man who had been reading land for 30 years and knew when someone was lying about it. Purcell, when asked to respond, gave answers that got shorter and less confident with each follow-up question until he was essentially agreeing in individual increments that his measurements were inconsistent with the geological record and that he had relied primarily on Caldwell's description of the property rather than his own independent survey. The panel took 1 hour to deliberate. When they came back, the lead judge set down his papers and looked at Henry Caldwell directly. The property counterclaim was dismissed. The fraudulent overcharging was confirmed across all 6 documented ranches, with formal findings of predatory business practice. The matter was referred to the state attorney's office for criminal fraud proceedings. Caldwell's existing property acquisitions in the northern corridor were flagged for review pending examination of whether they had been made under conditions of coerced debt. Caldwell sat through all of it without visibly reacting. Clara gave him credit for that. He was a man who knew how to take a loss without showing the damage, and he took this one the same way contained controlled already somewhere else in his head. Planning. He was the kind of man who was always already planning the next move. But the next move was going to be a great deal harder from where he was sitting now. When the panel adjourned, the room moved and resettled in the way rooms do when something formal has just ended, and the human responses that were held in check are allowed back in. Tom Aldridge gripped Ethan's hand and shook it. Ruth hugged Clara with the full, uncomplicated warmth of a woman who doesn't hold back. The other ranchers came and said what they had to say, and Clara stood in the middle of it and received it with a composure that was not distance, but something more solid, the composure of a woman who knows where she stands. Ethan found her after when most of the others had moved outside. He stood beside her in the clearing room and looked at her, and the expression on his face was the one she'd learned was his version of overwhelming. The face he made when something was larger than his usual vocabulary for it. "You walked in there with a hand-drawn map and a ledger," he said. "And 3 inches of documentation," she said. "And 3 inches of documentation," he agreed. "Against 2 lawyers and 30 years of Caldwell moving this county." "He moved it wrong," she said. "He moved it like everyone in it was manageable." Ethan looked at her. "Yeah," he said. He did. Outside Red Hollow was going to have to reckon with what it had watched happen. The town that had crossed the street and signed complaints and gone quiet on boardwalks, when it was easier than speaking, it was going to have to decide what it did with what it knew now. Some of it would take time. Some people would not change. Some would change slowly, and without acknowledging the change, which was probably the best you could expect from people who had spent long enough certain of the wrong thing that the right thing felt like a personal accusation. But Tom Aldridge had stood up in the meeting hall, and Jeb Morrow's wife had made her husband stand with her, and Margaret Whitmore had sat in a chair in front of a formal panel and told the uncomfortable truth about herself without flinching. It was a start. Ethan held out his arm to Clara. Not to take her weight, not to lead her just in the old Western courtesy of a man walking out of somewhere with someone he was proud to walk with. And she put her hand through it, and they walked out of the hearing room together into the afternoon. Behind them, Margaret Whitmore followed. Ahead of them, the road home went north, through the mountains, winding up through country that got steeper and quieter. The higher you climbed toward a low, solid house, and a desk with a lamp on it, and a barn where a man talked to his horses. In a low murmur, he didn't know anyone could hear. Clara Walker, as she would one day be walked toward it without looking back. She was done looking back. The road back from Glenwood Springs took 3 hours, and Clara spent most of them in a silence that was not empty but full, the kind that comes after something large has ended and you haven't yet figured out what to do with all the space it's left behind. Ethan rode beside her without filling the quiet, which was one of the things she had come to understand about him over these weeks, that he trusted silence the way other men trusted conversation. That he had learned somewhere along the way that presence didn't require noise. She was grateful for it. She needed the space to let what had happened settle through her without having to put words to it before it was ready. The hearing room. The panel's faces as she laid out the corridor map. The particular sound of a judge's gavel when a 30-year scheme gets taken apart by 3 inches of documentation, and a retired surveyor who'd been reading land since before Henry Caldwell learned to write his own name. She let it settle. She let it be real. Behind them, the small procession of wagons and riders gradually dispersed as each family turned off toward their own property. Tom and Ruth Aldridge heading west, with Ruth's hand raised in farewell. The other ranch families peeling away one by one until it was just Ethan and Clara on the Black Pine Road, and Margaret's wagon, a careful distance behind, and the sound of hooves on packed earth and the cooling afternoon. They stopped at the junction where the Black Pine Road split from the main track into town. Margaret pulled her wagon up beside them. The 3 of them were quiet for a moment, the way people are quiet when they've said most of the important things and are working out whether there are more. "You'll come for supper Sunday," Clara said to her mother. Not an invitation. A statement because she'd decided it was, and deciding things was still new enough to feel deliberate. Margaret looked at her. Something moved behind her eyes. Surprise maybe, or something more careful than surprise. Something that knew better than to take things for granted anymore. "I'll come Sunday," she said. She clicked her horse forward and turned toward town, and Clara watched her go until the sound of the wagon wheels faded into the general quiet of the mountain afternoon. Ethan said nothing. He waited. "She's going to take a long time," Clara said. "Most things worth having do," he said. Clara looked at the road ahead. "Let's go home," she said. They rode the last 1.5 miles without talking, and when the ranch came into sight, Clara felt something in her chest loosen. Something she hadn't known was still tight. The low, solid house with its good, strong bones. The barn. The fenced enclosures running north. The desk in the office with the lamp she'd burned past midnight, and the ledgers she'd straightened from 4 years of chaos. It looked like what it was, a place where work got done, and things were tended, and the people inside it were treated with the basic dignity of being seen. She swung down from the saddle before Ethan could offer a hand. She'd been getting off horses without help for 3 weeks now, and the small competence of it still gave her a quiet satisfaction, and she led her horse to the paddock, and saw to it, and came back to find Ethan already in the barn, doing what he always did when he came back from somewhere, which was checking on the animals before he checked on anything else, including himself. She leaned against the barn doorframe and watched him move through the space with the unhurried economy of a man who knows exactly what he's doing. "Ethan," she said. He looked up. "Thank you," she said, "for the room and the work and the all of it. I know you've said it wasn't charity, and I know you mean that. But I want you to know that it changed everything. That it was the difference between—" She stopped, found the words. "Between who I was on that step with a bag and $4 and who walked into that hearing room today." He held her gaze in that steady, full way of his. "You changed it," he said. "I handed you the ledgers. You did the rest." "You handed me something to be good at," she said. When someone's been told their whole life that they're nothing much, being handed a thing they're genuinely good at and being told, "So that's not small," He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I reckon it's not." He went back to the horses, and she went inside to start supper, and the ranch settled into its evening rhythms, the sounds of an animal shifting the creak of the barn, the smell of wood smoke. When she got the stove going, and all of it was ordinary and solid and entirely the most home she had ever felt anywhere. The weeks that followed the inquiry were not simple, because nothing real is simple, but they had a different quality than what came before. The criminal fraud referral moved forward slowly, as legal proceedings in 1886 moved slowly with the deliberate pace of institutions that didn't rush, regardless of how clear the evidence was. The state attorney's office sent a representative to Red Hollow who interviewed Ethan, interviewed Clara, interviewed Tom Aldridge and 3 other ranchers, and took copies of everything in the file. Caldwell's lumber mill kept operating. He was still in Red Hollow, still in his house on Birch Street, still a presence in the town's daily life. Clara passed him twice on the main street in the first 2 weeks after Glenwood, and both times she straightened her back and kept walking and let him be a man she'd already finished with rather than one she was still fighting. He did not speak to her either time. The complaint against her character was quietly withdrawn. Not with any announcement or apology, it simply disappeared from the county record the way complaints do when the person who filed them has more pressing concerns. Clara found out through Ferguson at the land office, who told her with the specific relief of a man who had felt bad about the whole thing and was glad to have something better to report. "It's withdrawn," he said. "Clean." "Thank you, Mr. Ferguson," she said. "Miss Whitmore, I want you to know that I didn't," he started. "I know," she said, not to excuse him but to move past it, because she had decided that the energy she used to spend managing the aftermath of other people's cowardice was energy she now had better uses for. "Thank you for telling me." Red Hollow adjusted. It did it the way small towns always do, not all at once and not cleanly, but in the gradual, grudging, unannounced way of a community recalibrating its story about itself. Women who had crossed the street began nodding when she passed. The dry goods merchant resolved the account issue with suspicious speed and no explanation. Mrs. Abernathy, Margaret's oldest acquaintance, who had watched everything from a careful distance, stopped Clara outside the post office one afternoon and said, "Your mother speaks very highly of what you've accomplished," with the particular mixture of admiration and defensiveness that meant she was paying Clara a compliment she hadn't entirely decided to yet. "That's kind of her," Clara said, "and kind of you to say so." She began going into town once a week on regular business supplies. The land office, the occasional visit to Ruth Aldridge, who had appointed herself something between a friend and an advocate, with the comfortable authority of a woman who had decided a thing and saw no reason to pretend she hadn't. Ruth introduced her around. Not the old introduction. Not, "Here's Clara Whitmore, Margaret's daughter. You know how it is." But a new one. "Here's Clara Walker. She manages the Black Pine Ranch accounts. Did you know she put together the entire case against Caldwell herself?" Clara corrected the last part each time. "With help," she'd say. "A lot of help." Ruth would wave her hand. "Don't go modest on me, honey. Modest women don't get remembered." "I don't particularly need to be remembered," Clara said once. "I just need to be right." Ruth looked at her. "Well," Ruth said, "you were both." The Sunday dinners with Margaret began the week after the inquiry and continued. They were not easy at first. Nothing genuinely reset between two people was easy at first, and Clara and her mother had 20 years of architecture to work through. That didn't come down all at once, just because someone had said sorry and meant it. But they were honest, which was new. Margaret asked questions instead of making pronouncements. She listened when Clara answered. She looked at the desk in the office with something that was no longer assessment, but something closer to respect. On the third Sunday, while Ethan was outside and they were washing dishes together, Margaret said, "I looked for work when your father died. Did you know that?" Clara looked at her. "I asked at the dry goods store. I asked at the dress shop. I asked at the bank." Margaret's hands kept moving in the dishwater. "Every one of them said they weren't hiring." What they meant was they weren't hiring a woman in my position, a widow with a child who had no specific training beyond running a household. She paused. I didn't know what to do with that. So I made the household into everything I knew how to manage, and I made you part of what I was managing. She stopped. I know that doesn't make it right. No, Clara said. It doesn't. I know. They washed dishes in silence for a moment. If you had found work, Clara said carefully, what would you have wanted to do? Margaret was quiet for a moment. I was good with numbers, she said. Your father used to say I could read a household budget better than any banker in the county. Something passed across her face, brief private, the flicker of a self she'd packed away. I suppose that's where you get it. Clara looked at her mother. Then it wasn't nothing, Clara said. What you taught me, even the way you taught it. Margaret pressed her lips together. Her eyes were bright. That's more generous than I deserve, she said. Probably, Clara agreed. But I'm choosing it anyway. It was 3 months after the inquiry, on a Tuesday evening in mid-October, that Ethan came in from the north fence line and stood in the kitchen doorway with an expression that was different from his usual expression, not upset, not closed, but with a particular quality of intention that Clara had learned to recognize. She was at the desk. She looked up. Sit down a minute, he said. She swiveled in the desk chair to face him. He came and sat in the chair across from her, the chair she'd placed there so ranchers or suppliers could sit while she worked through their questions, and he sat in it the way he sat in most things, solidly, without fuss. I had a conversation with Tom Aldridge this morning, he said. About the east pasture fence, she said. They'd been discussing a shared boundary repair with Tom for 2 weeks. No, he said. About you. Clara waited. He asked me a question, Ethan said. He asked me whether we'd formalized anything between us. A pause. I told him that was Clara's decision to make as much as mine. She held his gaze. And then he told me, Ethan continued, that Ruth has been after him for 3 weeks to tell me to stop being a damn fool and ask you properly. Clara's mouth moved, not quite a smile, but in that direction. Ruth said that, she said. She said damn and everything, Ethan confirmed. I've never heard her say damn before. I think she felt strongly. Clara looked at this man. This careful, solitary, difficult, entirely decent man who had stood on a boardwalk and told a truth nobody else would tell, and ridden to Glenwood in the dark, and trusted her with every broken piece of his accounts and his grief and his history, and who was now sitting in her office chair, with his hat in his hands, looking like a man who has decided to be brave about something scarier than a county fraud inquiry. Ask me properly then, she said. Quiet, warm, giving him the room. He looked at her. I love you, he said. Simple, direct, no preamble, and no decoration, the way he said everything true. I know I'm not easy company. I know I talk less than most people want, and I work more than is sociable, and I've got a grief in me that doesn't fully go away. But I would spend whatever I have left making sure you have the work and the space and the dignity you were owed all along and never got. And I would like very much, he said carefully, to call you mine, with your permission, if you'll have me. Clara stood up from the desk chair. She crossed the 2 steps between them and stood in front of him and put her hand on the side of his face, and he went very still, the way he always went still when something mattered. Yes, she said. He breathed out a long, slow, genuine exhale, the breath of a man who has been holding something tightly for a long time and has just been told he can put it down. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. He put his hand over hers, where it rested against his jaw, and they stayed like that for a moment in the office, with the ledgers on the desk, and the map on the wall, and the lamp burning low in the evening, and it was not a dramatic moment in the way stories sometimes make these moments, no sweep, no grand gesture. It was just 2 people who had been honest with each other for long enough to know what the honesty was worth, choosing each other, in a room they'd both worked hard to deserve. Then Clara said, I want you to know that I would have stayed regardless. He looked at her. "I know," he said. "I want you to know it anyway," she said. "Because you need to know the difference between someone who's here because you asked and someone who's here because she chose to be." He looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you," he said, "for saying so." "You're welcome," she said. "Now come have supper. I made that bean soup you said you'd had once at your mother's and never found again." He stood up. "You found that recipe," he said, with the first genuine surprise she'd seen on his face in weeks. "I asked Ruth," she said. "Her mother-in-law came from the same part of Tennessee yours did. Turns out it's the same recipe. There's a whole community of women in this county who've been holding that soup recipe together for 30 years, and not one man has ever noticed." He laughed. Not the almost smile, or the adjacent to humor expression she'd cataloged over the weeks. A real, full, unguarded laugh. The laugh of a man who has been reminded that the world is still surprising, and that some surprises are just good. It landed in the kitchen and Clara felt it in her chest, like the answer to a question she'd stopped expecting anyone to answer. They were married in November in a small ceremony at the Aldridge Ranch with Ruth Aldridge and Tom and the Morrow family, and a handful of others who had earned the right to be there by standing up when it counted, or by showing up in the quiet dailiness of the weeks that followed the inquiry. Margaret Whitmore sat in the front row in the good dress she had worn to Clara's father's church years before, and she did not cry in public because she was Margaret Whitmore, and that was simply not something she did. But at the moment when Clara and Ethan said what they said to each other, Margaret pressed both hands flat on her knees and looked at her daughter with an expression that Clara caught from the corner of her eye and filed away somewhere private and permanent. It was the expression of a woman who had finally seen her daughter clearly. Clara had waited 20 years for it. It was worth the wait. Not because she had needed it, she had learned in the months on the Black Pine that she did not need it in the bone-deep survival-dependent way she once had, but because some things matter on their own terms. Because a mother seeing her daughter clearly matters, regardless of whether the daughter has stopped needing it to survive. Reverend Blaine was not the one who performed the ceremony. They had found a traveling minister out of Glenwood who had no stake in Red Hollow's politics and said the words plainly and meant them. And when the words were done, Ethan took Clara's hand and she took his. And the room did what rooms do. At weddings, it exhaled and shifted and made the particular sound of people feeling something true. Hatch came because Clara had invited him, and he had said he didn't have anything else to do, and he sat in the back row and looked like a man who was privately glad he'd decided to ride up to the Black Pine that morning in September. Cass the writer came because he'd carried the envelope to Denver and considered himself personally invested in how the story ended. Tom Aldridge made a toast that was 3 sentences long and exactly right. Ruth cried enough for everyone and made no apology for it. The winter that followed was the hardest one the Black Pine had seen in years. Storms that came in sideways weeks of temperatures that made everything take twice as long and 3 times the effort. The particular grinding difficulty of keeping a working ranch alive through conditions that didn't care about human plans or human feelings. They lost 2 calves to a January freeze, despite everything they did to prevent it. A section of the north fence went down under ice weight and took 4 days to rebuild in conditions that made 4 days feel like 4 weeks. The water supply froze twice in February and had to be cleared by hand. Clara worked through all of it, not because she had to prove something to herself or to anyone else. She was past that particular need mostly, but because the work was hers and she was good at it, and there was a deep, uncomplicated satisfaction in being the person who knew what to do and did it. She kept the accounts current through the hardest months. She reorganized the supply ordering so that the ranch had enough of the right things before the storms hit, instead of trying to restock during them. She helped rebuild the fence section, working alongside Ethan and the 2 hands they'd brought on in October, and she was not as fast as the men, but she was steady, and she knew what she was doing, and nobody made any remark about it because on the Walker Ranch what you knew and what you could do was what mattered, and nothing else was worth remarking on. On the long evenings when the storms kept everyone inside, Clara read. She had brought very few books from her mother's house. The journal, a Bible, 1 collection of poetry she'd bought herself at 14, from a month's worth of carefully hoarded coins, And Ethan's library was small but surprisingly interesting for a man who claimed not to talk much. He had texts on land management, a natural history of Colorado, a dog-eared collection of Robert Burns, and tucked behind the practical volumes, a worn novel by Jane Austen that he claimed had belonged to his mother and that he clearly had read himself more than once based on the faint pencil marks in the margins. She asked him about the pencil marks one evening. He looked at the book, then at her. "James gave it to me after our mother died," he said. "Said she'd want me to read it. Said it was the kind of book that taught you something about how people worked if you paid attention." He paused. "I paid attention." Clara looked at the pencil marks' quiet observations in a small, precise hand. Characters, mostly. Notes about what they did and didn't say, and what the gap between the two revealed. "You were always reading people," she said. "Trying to," he said. "I'm better with land than with people, but I keep trying." She looked at him across the room, at this man with his pencil marks in an Austen novel, and his quiet attention, and his dead brother's voice still present in him like a compass. And she thought that she had come to the Black Pine believing she was ordinary, and had discovered instead that ordinary was a word people use for things they haven't looked at closely enough. She had been looked at closely. She had looked back. And what she'd found on both sides of that looking was not ordinary at all. Spring came. The way spring always comes at elevation, reluctantly, in stages, with a couple of late storms thrown in, as if the season wanted to make sure you'd genuinely committed to it before it committed back. But it came. The ground thawed. The cattle moved to the north pasture. The repair work from the winter damage was completed, and then some. In March, Clara began keeping a second set of records. Not for the Walker Ranch, those were immaculate and current, and she could run them in her sleep by now. These were for the 3 other ranch families who had come to her after the inquiry and asked carefully and without much elaboration whether she might be willing to take a look at their accounts. She took a look. She found what she found, not fraud on the scale of Caldwell's work, mostly just the ordinary chaos of capable people in demanding work who had never had time to make the numbers do what they needed them to do. And she put them in order and showed each family what she'd done and why, and she charged a fair fee for the work and did not undercharge or apologize for charging. Ethan watched this develop without comment for about 3 weeks, and then one evening said, "You're building something." "I'm building something," she agreed. "Something that's yours," he said. "Something that's mine," she said. "Does that bother you?" He looked at her with the expression she'd learned meant he found the question surprising in a way he was about to explain. "Why would it bother me?" he said. "Some men don't like their wives to have—" "I'm not some men," he said. "I know," she said, "but I'm asking." He thought about it seriously, the way he took serious questions. "I married you because of who you are," he said. "Who you are includes being someone who sees problems in numbers that other people miss and fixes them. If I wanted you to stop doing that, it would be like—" He paused, looking for the right comparison. "Like asking the north fence to stop holding cattle. It's what you're built for. I'd be a fool to want less of it." Clara looked at him. "You're a very reasonable man," she said. "I'm a practical man," he corrected. "Reasonable is something else. I just know what I have." By summer, she had 6 ranch accounts. By the following spring, she had 11, and Tom Aldridge had started sending people to her from as far as 2 counties over. Not the wealthiest operations mostly, but the ones who were fighting to keep land that had been in their families for a generation and couldn't afford to lose it, to the kind of slow financial erosion that comes from not having anyone watching the numbers carefully enough. She met them at the kitchen table, or at their own tables when riding out made more sense. She looked at what they had, and what they owed, and what could be saved, and what had to be let go, and she told them the truth about all of it, and they listened to her the way people listen to someone they have good reason to trust. She became known in the northern county as the woman who kept the accounts. Not with any fanfare. She didn't want fanfare and didn't court it. But if you asked in Glenwood Springs who to see about ranch financial management, her name came up, and it came up consistently. And the people who said it the way you recommend something you know firsthand to be reliable. Henry Caldwell's criminal fraud case moved through the state system with the slowness of large mechanisms. The proceedings lasted most of 1887 and into 1888. Clara testified twice, once in deposition, once at the formal hearing. She was precise and clear, and answered exactly what was asked without elaboration or editorializing. And when Caldwell's defense attorneys tried to suggest that her documentation was motivated by personal interest, she said, "My personal interest was in the truth of the numbers. The numbers are true, regardless of my interest in them." And the hearing examiner wrote something down and did not follow up the line of questioning. Caldwell was found guilty on 7 counts of fraudulent business practice and 2 counts of filing false documentation with the state land office. He was fined substantially and lost the properties he'd acquired through leveraged debt that the court found had been manufactured. He kept his lumber mill, the legal operation of it stripped of the overcharging scheme, and he stayed in Red Hollow because men like Henry Caldwell do not leave the places they've marked as theirs. But he stayed smaller than he'd been, and the particular authority he'd held over the county's business moved to other hands. Some of those hands over time were Clara's. Not through any agenda. She hadn't come to this with a plan beyond surviving the step she was on. But competence exercised honestly over time creates its own gravity. People came to her because she knew what she was doing, and she did it without deception, and in a county that had spent several years learning the cost of deception that had a particular value. On the 2nd anniversary of the evening, she'd sat on her mother's step with a bag and $4.60. Clara sat at the desk in the ranch office and looked at the ledgers spread before her, her own and the others. All of it current and organized and exactly what it needed to be. And she thought about who had sat at that desk first. A girl who believed she was too ordinary, too quiet, too much trouble. Who had believed those things because someone she loved had said them often enough and early enough that they had become the architecture of her understanding of herself, the load-bearing walls, the structural fact of who she was in the world. She thought about the moment on the boardwalk when a man she didn't know had said something true, and how that single true thing had cracked the architecture in a way that couldn't be uncracked. Not because he'd saved her, he hadn't, but because he'd interrupted the story long enough for her to notice there was another one. She had written the other one herself. Ethan appeared in the office doorway. He had that particular look he got in the evening sometimes, not the intention, look, not the something to say look, just the look of a man checking on something he values. "Still at it," he said. "Almost done," she said. "Tom's quarterly comes due Friday." He came in and leaned against the doorframe and looked at the desk with the expression that was now so familiar she sometimes forgot to notice it. The one that was not pride exactly, because it wasn't about him, but was something adjacent to pride. The expression of someone watching a thing be exactly what it should be. "Hatch wrote," he said. "He's coming through next month. Wants to see what you've done with the east boundary markers." "Tell him I improved on Donaldson," she said. "He'll argue with you about that for 3 days," Ethan said. "Good," she said. "I'll have the records ready." He smiled, the full, real smile she'd had to wait months for the first time, and that now came more freely still, not often, still earned, still worth more than if it had been cheap. He pushed off the doorframe and went back to the kitchen, and she heard him moving in there, the comfortable domestic sounds of a man starting the evening fire, checking the coffee, and she turned back to the ledger and finished Tom Aldridge's quarterly with the steady, unhurried hand of someone doing work they were built for. Margaret came on Sundays, and they were better now, the two of them. Not uncomplicated. They were never going to be uncomplicated, and Clara had stopped expecting it. But better in the way that genuine things get better slowly, with evidence with each honest conversation, adding to the structure of something new, being built on the cleared ground of the old. Margaret had taken on the parish school's account books, a suggestion Clara had made carefully, and her mother had received carefully, and then executed with the sharp, thorough competence Clara recognized in the bone because she'd inherited it. "You're good at this," Clara told her, reviewing the work one Sunday. "I know," Margaret said. Matter of fact, almost surprised by the knowing the way someone is surprised when they remember they were hungry. In October of 1888, Dottie Pierce's daughter came to Clara. She was 19 years old, and she'd been working in Henry Caldwell's house as a domestic since she was 15, and she'd been receiving wages that Clara, after 5 minutes with the girl's description of her hours and duties calculated, were roughly 30% below what they should have been. "He always told me I was lucky to have the work," the girl said. Her name was Nora, and she had her mother's particular directness, the Pierce family quality of saying what was true without warming up to it. "He said most girls in my position wouldn't get what I was getting." Clara looked at her. "Does that sound familiar?" Ethan said from the doorway. "It does," Clara said. She looked at Nora. "You're not lucky to have work. You're owed a fair wage for work you do. Those are different things." Nora looked at her with the expression Clara recognized from a long time ago in a different face in a kitchen in Red Hollow, the expression of someone who has just heard a thing said plainly that they had been preventing themselves from thinking clearly. "What do I do?" Nora said. "You document it," Clara said. "You write down what you did when you did it, what you were told you'd be paid, and what you were actually paid. You bring it to the county labor office in Glenwood, and then you find better work, and you take it." "Will anyone listen?" Nora said. Clara looked at the wall where the acquisition corridor map still hung hand-drawn, sourced accurate. The map that had helped bring down 30 years of calculated predation. "People are listening more than they used to," she said. "And it gets easier the more times it's done." She helped Nora put together her documentation over the following week. It was smaller than the Caldwell fraud file, simpler, more contained the single story of one young woman and what she was owed, but it was put together with the same thoroughness and the same clarity, and when it went to the county labor office, it was not ignored. Nothing she built was ignored anymore. She understood now that this was not about her being exceptional. She was good at what she did. Yes, she'd always been good at it, even when she'd been told it was a servant's skill, a lesser thing. But what had changed was not her ability. What had changed was her willingness to take the ability seriously, to bring it to bear, to say, "This is what I know, and it is worth something, and I am worth the knowing of it." That was the thing her mother hadn't taught her. That was the thing she'd had to find on her own on a step in the dark, with a bag through a man who'd trusted her with his broken books, through a file that went to Denver and came back as a federal inquiry. You do not become worth something. You were worth something. The question is only when you decide to act like it. On a Thursday evening in November of 1888, 2 years and 5 months after Clara had first ridden up the Black Pine Road with everything she owned in a bag that fit in one hand, she sat on the front porch of the Walker Ranch and looked at the ridge and listened to the evening settle around her. Inside, she could hear Ethan's voice low and even talking to someone, and after a moment, she realized it was just him talking to the horses in the barn, the way he always did, thinking no one could hear. The murmur that didn't require an audience. The sound of a man at home in himself and his place is. She had that now. That quality of being at home in herself. It had come slowly and with work, and with the help of someone who had never once asked her to be less than she was, and it did not feel like an arrival so much as a settling the feeling of something finding the level it was always meant to be at. She thought about the girl on the step. She thought, "I would go back and tell her it doesn't take as long as you think. I would tell her that the thing you've been told is your flaw, that directness, that competence, that refusal to be arranged is not a flaw. It is the whole of you, and someone is coming who will know that on sight, and you will know him by the fact that he looks at you and does not look away, and he will say one true thing, and the whole architecture will crack, and what comes through the crack will be you, just you, the you that was always there." I would tell her, "Be patient a little longer." And then I would tell her, "You already know how to be patient. You've been patient your whole life. The difference is that soon the patience will be for something worth having." Inside the barn, the low murmur continued. A horse responded with the kind of soft sound that means contentment. The evening deepened around the ranch and the ridge went dark above it, and a single lamp came on in the kitchen window, warm and steady and absolutely certain. Clara Whitmore. Clara Walker, now by choice and by love and by the full authority of her own decision, sat on the porch of the ranch she had helped save and the life she had helped build, and she was not waiting for anything anymore. She had stopped waiting the evening she picked up her bag and said yes, and rode up into the dark toward a room with an iron latch and a desk full of broken ledgers and a future she was going to make herself. Some women are carried out of their old lives. Clara Walker walked out of hers, and she never looked back.